let me just double check if Copano is here. No. Great. So I'm just going to move us forward a little bit here. Give me 2 seconds.
Tiffany, we have a response from Copano in the Q&A just to say he's having trouble accessing the audio at the moment.
Great. So we'll come back to Copano momentarily. There's so many people in the chat that it's flagging on top of where I changed the slides, so it's making it a struggle to move forward. But there we go. We're forward now. So just a few housekeeping issues before we come to Copano, who's going to give us opening remarks today. So you are all muted. So if you've been trying to speak to us, I do see there's a couple hands raised as well. Not to worry. That's on purpose. It's just so that there's no accidental interruptions, but we do want to hear from you. So please make use of that Q&A box. You'll see there's 2 options, a chat, which is 1 speech bubble, and then the Q&A, which is 2 speech bubbles. If you use the 2 speech bubbles, the Q&A option, that tracks all of the questions. So it stays there until we answer it. And so if you have any questions about the standards or how to implement them, how to make sure that you're using them correctly, please make use of that Q&A. Use the chat to talk to each other, but as you can see, you're such a large audience today, that chat can kind of just go quite quickly and not everybody's able to see it. So please make use of it, but know that your questions will probably get lost there. So please ask them in the Q&A. So just a quick overview of what we're looking at today. So we're together for a full morning or perhaps afternoon, depending on where you might be. Evening for one of our speakers. And I think I hear Copano. Is that?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I do hear you. I don't see you, but I definitely hear you.
Okay.
I'll come back here to your opening remarks though, and if we can hear you, that's sufficient. So just to give a big welcome and a thank you. So the Botswana Stock Exchange is hosting us today and is responsible for bringing you all together. We're so grateful. We've been partners with the Botswana Stock Exchange and working together with Copano and his team for quite some time now. We're very pleased for all the hard work they're doing in the sustainability arena. Thanks so much for asking us to come today and bring this educational tool to your market. And I'd love to introduce Copano Bolokwe, who is the Acting Chief Executive Officer at the Botswana Stock Exchange, to kick us off and provide those opening remarks. So over to you, Copano.
Good morning to you all. Thank you. I just thought I should show my face and then I would go back to audio without video, so I could also access my welcome remarks. Thank you, Tiffany.
Sure. So do you just need a minute to figure that out?
Am I still connected?
I still hear you. I don't see you.
Yes, all right. No, that's fine.
Okay.
So it's really an honor to meet with all of you in this audience this morning. And it is often said that history doesn't repeat itself. But I'm humbled at how the Sustainable Stock Exchanges initiative has come back again to partner with us to build capacity in our market. Special thanks to Tiffany and her team, Fiona, Louise, and Landon. The establishment of the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Academy has been very impactful, as the Academy seeks to provide award-winning, global, consistent, and pragmatic training to market participants on the adoption and implementation of sustainable finance practices. Together with its education partners, the SSE Academy develops certified training programs made available to capital market participants free of charge, with the objective of supporting the education and training needs of stock exchanges. And the SSE does this in partnership with experts and specialists in these areas, as we are seeing today. This explains why this morning we are honored with the presence of IFRS and IFC. And special thanks to Jarlath and Bella from IFRS and to Raliza from IFC. As most of you would know, the BSE is a partner exchange of the Sustainable Stock Exchanges initiative, which is an a UN partnership program organized by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, the United Nations Global Compact, the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative, and the Principles for Responsible Investing. It's a global platform on exploring how exchanges in collaboration with investors, companies or issuers, regulators, policymakers, and relevant international organizations can enhance performance on environmental, social, and governance issues and encourage sustainable investment, including the financing of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. We are honored as the BSC to continue to benefit extensively from this platform through peer-to-peer learning, capacity building, research coverage, and global best practices. We are even more honored to be able to bring our ecosystem and stakeholders represented by yourselves in this webinar this morning. Benefit. In August this year, the BSC launched the BSC Sustainability Disclosure Guidance, which are anchored on the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI standards, the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, as well as the IFRS Sustainability Reporting Standards, S1 and S2. This webinar will help you to implement these guidelines in your respective organizations and in your advisory work within the capital markets. As you would note, the major top driver globally for the rising interest in sustainable investing is that investors are interested in the financial performance and the impact of sustainable investment. So we have moved purely from financial returns to now considering impact in the investments we make. The presence of the International Finance Corporation, IFC, this morning is therefore critical, as IFC is among the largest impact investors globally. In fact, it is our hope IFC will in the near future be helpful and active locally in Botswana to anchor some of the impact-oriented investments that will be listed on the BSC, as their participation always signals strong confidence and assures that rigor, diligence, and best practices have been applied. I therefore thank the IFC ESG officer, Aliza, for being part of the facilitators of today's webinar, as this cements our relationship with the corporation. IFC has been present in our market as they issued the first Kalahari bond, or supranational bond of the BSC in 2018, the proceeds of which were used to support one of our local banks. With these remarks, please allow me to welcome you all to the webinar and encourage you to be interactive so you can walk away with the most enlightenment. I took part in the training myself in 2023 when it was hosted by the Nigerian Stock Exchange. And that's where my team and I saw the need to request the same for Botswana. And I can assure you that it is the beginning of many similar trainings, as the SSC Academy offers training areas such as gender equality and capital markets, TCFD for banks, introductory and advanced training on impact reporting with GRI, to mention but a few. I wish you a productive morning and you're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kopano, for joining us today and for the great effort that you and your team have done to bring everyone together today. I'll build on that encouragement from the CEO of the exchange to really engage with us and encourage everyone indeed to take this opportunity to ask the questions you might have and to participate. Now, we have a few ways you can participate with us. One of them is through that Q&A, asking your questions, but also we're going to do activities together using a technology called Mentimeter. We're also going to quiz you through some polls and ask you questions. So please do actively participate in this workshop to be able to get the most out of it. Then at the end, to reward you for that participation, we will provide you a certificate. You just have to stick around to the end and we will share with you a link to a feedback survey. And once you fill in that feedback survey, within maximum 5 working days, you will receive your certificate for participating in this workshop. Now, just a few quick introductions of all of us on the call. You might have seen there's quite a few panelists here today. We've brought you a lot of expertise today. So my name is Tiffany Grabski. I'm the SSE Academy head, and I'm so pleased to have a large team with us here today. We have with us today Lois Guthrie, who is the senior SSE senior specialist at the SSE. She has been working in this space for quite some time and brings a lot of knowledge and expertise in this this area, and she's going to be sharing with us a number of examples today to really add color to what we're talking about. I'm also so pleased to be joined by our colleagues, SSE training officers and project officers. We have Fiona Quinlan-Wells, who's here with us today. Hi, Fiona, thanks for joining. And we also have Landon Wilcock, who's also joining us today and managing the Zoom and the slides. And both of them are also going to be facilitating today various parts of our training. Now, all of us will be following the Q&A, so please do feel free to ask questions to any of us. Now, the real experts in the room here today are the Jarlath Malloy and Bella Chang, who join us from the IFRS Foundation. Jarlath is the Director of Strategic Affairs, and very similar to Lois, has a wealth of experience. Not only is he running a number of capacity building programs at the IFRS Foundation, but he also does their own reporting on sustainability and has done so for a few companies himself. So he knows what it's like to be within the company working on preparing these reports. And we're also joined with Bella Chang, who's capacity building specialist at the IFRS Foundation, who's joining us from Beijing tonight, so evening her time. And she has been working with companies, guiding them on their disclosure journeys for quite some time too. So very happy to have this expertise. We also have Robert here with us from the IFRS Foundation, who's joining us in the background. So thanks so much, Robert. This team from the IFRS Foundation is also here to help us answer all of your questions in the Q&A. And we will have joining us today too the IFC. So the IFC is part of the World Bank Group, and they can definitely add a perspective from the investor side of why this information is needed and how it's being used. Relitza Germanova is an ESG officer and has been a longtime expert on corporate governance. So when she joins us a bit later, she can check out your questions on corporate governance as well. Now, our training does have a few objectives. I'm going to run through these quickly to make sure we have time for the content. But our first objective today is to help you to understand what are the ISSB standards. Our second objective today is to help you to understand how to use the ISSB standards. And then finally, we're here to help you identify what are those first steps you can take. And we're going to do that through discussing a disclosure plan. Now, the disclosure plan is part of our homework, so I'll get to exactly what that means in a minute. But to achieve those objectives, we broke down our training into 4 distinct modules. So we're going to start with the prepare module, which does what's on the label. It helps you prepare. So there we're going to talk about the case for sustainability reporting and how that landscape has evolved. And then we're also going to introduce what are the IFRS standards and how do they come to be. Then we're going to move on to the align module, and think of the align module as really just getting you on the right train tracks, keeping you moving in the right direction. So what global standard can you use to make sure you're moving in the right direction? And today we're here to talk about the IFRS standard as a global baseline. However, we recognize that many of you are using GRI, as Capano was mentioning, or other frameworks. So we're going to talk about at the end of that module how to build on top of the IFRS standards with any other frameworks you might be using. After we get clear what are the standards and exactly what's required in those standards, we're going to look at how do you start implementing that. And that really comes down to risks and opportunities. So how do you identify, evaluate, and integrate those risks and opportunities? And then finally, the communication aspect. What does that report look like? Where do you disclose the information? How do you do it efficiently? And how do you build confidence in your disclosure? A quick look at the agenda, which hopefully you also saw on our website. Just to note, we're taking it a module at a time, but we're going to break module 2 up a little bit just to take a short break. Now, 5 minutes is not a long break for a 3.5-hour session. We do recognize that. However, it was the only way we could pack all of this knowledge into one session. So do take that 5-minute break to grab a tea, move around, do a quick stretch, get that blood flowing again. But hopefully you find the rest of it interactive enough and engaging enough that you're interested to stay for the full session. We also have some training material I wanted to flag. Note that all of this is available on our website. So Fiona is going to be sharing in the chat, and we'll put it time and time again there because we realize the chat's moving quite quickly. But she's going to be sharing in the chat where you can find on our website all the training materials. So that's already up there. You can download these slides. You can also get the homework assignment. Now that homework assignment is back to that disclosure plan. So that's not a requirement of the IFRS standards. However, we find it to be a useful tool as you're starting to think, what is the next step moving forward? You should start putting pen to paper and planning your disclosure. And we're going to help you through that today. After each module, we're going to do one of the activities of your homework if we have time. And that'll get you started already on your homework assignment. Now, just remember, this is not a requirement. It's just to help you keep your learning journey moving forward when you finish today's training. A few more tools you might want to use. The SSE has a toolkit on this topic, so you can see all the tools on your screen. I won't go through them in detail, but if you want to dive deeper into certain topics such as transition planning or climate-related metrics, for example, you can use these training tools to get a few more resources and point you in the right direction. We'll also be talking today about the gap analysis checklist. This is a very simplified checklist of the standards to just help you identify what might be missing in your disclosure. So it's a useful starting tool, but of course should not replace reading the standards themselves. Now, before we kick off into the training itself, we want to know what you're doing here and exactly what you need from this workshop. So I'm going to ask my colleague Fiona if she could share the Menti screen. And we're going to start off by asking you, why did you join today's training? Now, you will also get in the chat box a link to this Menti, but you can use if you're not joining on your phone, hopefully, you can use your phone, point your camera at that QR code on the bottom left of the screen, and that'll open up on your phone this question and you can answer it. Or you can make use of that little bit on the top which says join at www.menti.com. So you can just type in menti.com into your web browser, and then that code at the top will bring you to this question. So you can go type in 7406-9836, or use that link Fiona shared in the chat. And Fiona, you might have to share that a few times because it's probably going to disappear pretty quick. Great. So we'll give you all a moment just to join that Menti. We have a few of you that have managed to join so far. I want to make sure that all of you are able to access it because this is one of the ways we're going to be communicating with each other today. Great. So implementation so far is the #1 word, which is great to see. So maybe you're already fairly aware of how that these standards exist and what they are. But you need to know more about how to move forward. Learn is also one that's growing in knowledge, learning, gaining knowledge, educate. Yeah, so a lot of you are looking to just build your expertise on this topic, which is fantastic. Gain knowledge, we see in the chat as well. That's all great. So we can help with all of that. That's no problem. Maybe Fiona, let's move to the next one and see where everyone's comfort level currently sits on our 3 objectives. So if you have this open already now, it'll just change to a new slide. So a new question should be asked in the same browser. You don't have to open a new Menti. The same one will be working for you now. And it'll be asking you, how comfortable are you with each of these tasks? So the first being, how comfortable are you to explain to a team member what the ISSB is? The second being, how comfortable are you using the ISSB standards? And then finally, how comfortable are you in developing a sustainability reporting strategy? Now, it looks like there's not a huge amount of comfort on any of these topics, which are our objectives of the training today. But the most comfort I see is some of you are quite comfortable in explaining the ISSB standards, which is great, but less comfort on using them. So hopefully we can build that expertise on how to implement and make use of these standards. And it looks like not many people are comfortable with developing a reporting strategy. So our homework exercise will be well used, hopefully, after today's session. That's great. Good to see that. Fiona, you can stop sharing then, and we'll go back to the slide deck that Landon can reshare for us. Thanks, Landon. Okay, so with that, let's dive straight into the content. And before we share with you a bunch of examples, we just want to give a quick disclaimer here. I'll leave this disclaimer on the screen for you. But just to note how we're using the examples today is to add some color, as I said earlier, to what we're talking about. So sometimes it can really help to have real life examples to see how this is being implemented in practice. However, the examples should not be seen as the best way or even the right way for your particular company. Keep in mind that sustainability in particular really varies from one company to the next. So you'll want to be finding the best way for your particular organization. And we're not necessarily endorsing any of these companies. We're just showing you what some companies might be doing currently. So to kick us off, oh, someone's changing slides. I'm not sure who that was, but I'm going to move forward and maybe just ask all the presenters that have the ability to change slides, be very careful where you point to your mouse. So we're going to kick off with module 1. I can see Landon's doing something on the slide deck too. Landon, we can see the thing pop up. Thanks. Module 1, as I said, is preparation. So here, when we're preparing, there's 3 areas we want to look at. We want to look at the purpose of disclosure. We want to look at the landscape, what's been happening in the disclosure landscape. And then we want to look at that global baseline, the IFRS S1 and S2. So to kick us off on purpose, we're looking at what is the case for and market drivers for sustainability reporting. And to start off, I'm going to launch a little poll here. So there we go. That should pop up on your screen. We want to know, what are your reasons for disclosing sustainability-related information? Is it regulatory requirements? Is it because you're being asked to in your market? Is it because you want to share your management's objectives? Is it peer pressure or societal expectations to be disclosing this information? Or is that expectation coming from investors? Is it investor interest? Perhaps there's another reason, and we'd love to hear from you in the chat what that might be. Or maybe you're not disclosing any sustainability related information yet, which is fine. We're here to help you get started on that. So we'll give you just a moment to fill that in. Some of you have put it in the chat. Someone said for knowledge expansion and growth. Oh, that might have been for our last question though. Consumer interest. So yeah, the societal expectations, perhaps your clients or your consumers are requiring it. So let's see what you all said. I'm sharing the results now, so you should see it, but about half of you said regulatory requirements, which is often our top pick here. We're seeing regulation come through all around the world that's affecting even beyond the borders that they're impacting because they deal with supply chains and value chains as well. But it's good to see that many of you are also sharing this information in order to share the management's objectives. Maybe your organization already is evaluating sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and you'd like to make sure that investors and other users of your report are able to see what you're doing and see the value you're adding to your company that way. Some of you are doing it because you're kind of expected to. Your clients, your peers, others are doing this already, and you need to just keep up. And quite a few of you, 32% of you, said investor interest. Now, investor interest is really where these standards came from, investor demand. And we've also seen recently the ISSB launched a voluntary guidance, which came from investor demand as well. So we are seeing a lot of investor demand. Let's look at a little bit what that looks like. Great. So here you might be familiar with the PRI, the Principles of Responsible Investment. And as you can see here, signatories of these principles, of the principles of responsible investment, are growing significantly. So there's now more than 5,000 signatories of those principles, and they represent more than $121 trillion in assets under management by signatories of these principles. What I think is important to note is what's driving this push in the investor community. Many might think it's philanthropy or trying to do good or a recognition of doing good. But interestingly, as you'll see in this study, which was done on retail investors by Morgan Stanley, actually shows that it's not necessarily philanthropy or doing good. It's actually financial performance that's driving this push in the investor community. Investors are understanding that there's a connection between sustainability related risks and opportunities and how an organization manages those risks and opportunities and their financial performance. As you can see, some other key drivers are new climate science findings, which helps us understand even better those risks and opportunities. Also, broader economic performance, inflation, and legislation, which comes back to the regulatory side. Now, when we're talking about effects on financial performance, I'm not going to dive too much into these because I want to make sure we have time to get into the standards themselves. But we're talking about actual effects on the balance sheet of a company. So let's just make sure that we understand this to an extent. So when we're talking about effects on financial performance, we're talking about changes in the revenue mix, for example, or the total revenue, or, for example, changes in expenditures. Now, we can also see that there can be effects on the financial position of a company. And you might hear us say that a lot through the training, the financial position or the financial performance. And when we're talking about effects that climate related or sustainability related risks or opportunities have on a company's financial position, we mean there could be changes due to these risks and opportunities on a company's assets or their liabilities. So, for example, changes to the portfolio or changes to the equity or the liabilities in the carrying amount of assets, or maybe write-offs that have to be made, maybe even early retirement of assets, or also changes to financing and the cost of capital. For example, insurance premiums, as we're seeing, are getting incredibly high in certain areas, and also not being able to insure certain assets anymore. Now, before we dive into the evolution of the disclosure landscape, I think it's really important to flag a few things about sustainability, I think, that are quite important. So as you can see on this slide, this is the latest global risk perception survey from the World Economic Forum, and it shows how risks evolve over time. So the risks that might be concerning our leadership of our organizations today and in the next year or two are actually drastically different from the risks that are concerning us 10 years in the future. But what's important to keep in mind is that when we are thinking about those risks, maybe 10 years or 20 years down the line, they often require an investment today in order to mitigate those risks or capitalize on the opportunities that come with them. So the time element is quite important when we're talking about sustainability related risks and opportunities. Another aspect is the connections between them. So many people, for example, think of the ISSB standards as two separate standards, one for climate and one for other sustainability topics. However, as you can see on this slide, which is from that same report from the World Economic Forum, different types of sustainability related risks are all very much connected. And we're going to talk about all sorts of connections today because it's not just the risks and the opportunities that are connected. There are many other interconnectivities that we want to be aware of, but it's important to keep in mind those two aspects when we're discussing these disclosures, the time aspect and the connectivity aspect, to make sure that we're really understanding the whole picture of sustainability related risks and opportunities. Now, with that very brief intro to the topic, I'd love to pass to my colleague, Fiona, who's going to take us through the next unit. Over to you, Fiona.
Thanks very much, Tiffany. Brilliant. So we've covered there briefly the why of disclosure. So let's look at how the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards developed in the landscape of reporting standards. So to start with that, we're going to move to another quick poll just to get a sense of where you're at with different reporting frameworks currently. So you should hopefully see that popping up on the screen momentarily. Great. So yeah, it'd be useful just to give us a sense of which of the different sustainability frameworks you might already be using. So it may be that you're not using any of them, and that's absolutely fine. Feel free to just give us a sense of which ones you are using. And if the one that you're using isn't listed there, feel free to select other and let us know in the chat as well. So I'll just give you a quick second to respond on that. I see many responses coming in rapidly, so that's great. Great. So it looks like integrated reporting is coming out very strongly as one of the key frameworks being used there as well. But with a number of you using CDP and GRI already, and a few others using the other frameworks as well. So that's super useful to get a sense of that. Thanks for letting us know. So I'll just share those results there so you can see that final picture. Brilliant. So yeah, that's very helpful to get a sense. So moving on then, sorry, just catch my screen up there. Moving on then to the IFRS Foundation and its work on frameworks. So we'll take a moment to understand what the IFRS Foundation is and how the ISSB in particular came to be. So the IFRS Foundation is a not-for-profit public interest organisation. It was established to develop high-quality, understandable, enforceable, globally accepted accounting and sustainability reporting standards. So the IFRS Foundation hosts two independent standard-setting bodies. So we have the International Accounting Standards Board, the IASB, which was formed in 2001. And these standards are in place in over 140 jurisdictions across the world. And then we also have the International Sustainability Standards Board, which was formed in 2021. And it released its first two standards in 2023, following strong market demand for their establishment. Governance is provided by trustees, who in turn are accountable to a monitoring board of public authorities. The ISSB works closely with IASB to ensure that their standards complement each other. So the evolution of reporting standards. So all of these organizations you see on the screen have contributed to the evolution of sustainability reporting. In fact, they all have a lot in common. So the range of objectives, guidelines, and standards on offer has caused some confusion in the market. And this is sometimes referred to as the alphabet soup. So most of these organizations here focus on meeting investor needs for sustainability information, except for GRI, which supports a broader range of stakeholders. So some of these organizations consolidated into the IFRS Foundation to form the basis of the IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards. And the standards were also built on the TCFD recommendations. So those of you that have been reporting in line with TCFD will also find them very familiar. And for this reason, the publishing of the ISSB standards also marked the culmination of the TCFD's work. And as a result, the TCFD has now disbanded. Meanwhile, we also have the CDP climate change questionnaire. That's also aligned now to IFRS S2. And the IFRS Foundation has also agreed to take over responsibility for the materials of the Transition Plan Task Force, or TPT. So as a result, you can see the reporting landscape has been significantly simplified, and there's more work ongoing to harmonise and further simplify as we develop guidance to support this. Great, so we'll move on now to another quick Zoom poll just to test your understanding here. So a quick question to get a true or false response from you on. So companies who disclose using the TCFD recommendations automatically comply with the ISSB standards. So just take a quick moment to let us know whether you think the answer to that is true or false. Great, I see many responses coming in very rapidly. We have a close tie between true and false at the moment, so I'll give you one more quick second just to let us know what you think on that. Super, so let's close out the poll there. Hopefully most of you had the chance to respond. So we'll see we just had true coming ahead of false there, but quite an even split across the room as to what we thought. And the correct answer is actually false. And we'll come on to explain that in a little bit more detail. But if you're disclosing using the TCFD, you're definitely well underway towards the ISSB. But there are some more detailed requirements under the IFRS S1 standard on sustainability information that go beyond climate as well. So we'll move on now to look at that in a bit more detail. So a particular listing requirement that you might have heard of previously that got a lot of traction was the TCFD. So many companies are now asking what's next for their TCFD reporting, since, as we mentioned already, the TCFD has disbanded. And that leaves the progress monitoring on TCFD performance to the IFRS Foundation. So it's important to say that companies should continue to report against the TCFD if they're required to do so until they're advised differently by their relevant regulator in their jurisdiction. The ISSB standards incorporate the TCFD recommendations and use the same architecture. So many companies that have prepared a TCFD report are well placed to complete the additional steps to fully adopt the IFRS S1 and S2 standards. The ISSB is focused on developing standards that provide a common language and therefore a global baseline for sustainability information. It wants to enable comparable and consistent sustainability disclosures across global capital markets. The Foundation works with jurisdictions across the world, as well as other stakeholders to achieve this. So regulators and stock exchanges are able to require companies to disclose further information by adding their own additional building blocks tailored to their needs, for example, the stock exchange's model guidance. So additional disclosures can be required as long as they provide information that's presented in a way that doesn't obscure the required ISSB disclosures. And these building blocks could also involve disclosures going beyond the remit of the ISSB, for example, GRI, or they could include jurisdiction-specific information relevant to investors. So taking this building block approach reduces the need to duplicate information by having that globally consistent baseline of disclosures, but still allows you to report additional information based on standards like the GRI. So following the launch of the ISSB standards in 2023, the International Organization for Securities Commissions, or IOSCO, announced its endorsement of the ISSB standards. And IOSCO actually asked their 130 members to consider how they can incorporate the ISSB standards into their regulatory frameworks. The Foundation continues to engage with other stakeholders on adoption and related issues, for example, with the IIASB on a new assurance standard that it's going to launch shortly. And as part of the Foundation's regulatory implementation programme, the IFRS is supporting multiple jurisdictions with planning and preparation for voluntary and mandatory adoption. And IFRS also talking to stakeholders around the world who are planning to support voluntary disclosure against the new standards. So that's just a flavour of the landscape as we see it at the moment. I'll now hand over to Charlotte, who's going to talk about the prepare phase of reporting.
Thanks, Fiona. Okay. So we've talked about the business case and the market case for sustainability reporting, the evolution of the landscape, and how it's being simplified and rationalized. Let's start now looking at S1 and S2. Cool. So as we get started, it's important to note there are some key terms that should be understood. And don't worry, you can find the definitions in your handout, which will be if you've been watching the chat, the link is in there, and you'll get it afterwards. But I wanted just to pause here for a moment and briefly mention them. So first of all, we'll be using the phrase sustainability-related financial information quite a lot in this session. And really, we're just simply referring to a broad set of issues, which includes climate, nature, biodiversity, social aspects, and many, many others. Sustainability-related financial information is information about a company's sustainability risks and opportunities that's useful to investors in making decisions about providing resources to your company. Sustainability-related risks and opportunities are those that could reasonably be expected to affect your company's cash flows, your company's access to finance, or the cost of capital to your company in the short, in the medium, and in the long term. We'll also often refer to general purpose financial reports, which includes a company's financial statements and the management commentary. Now, you might know this as a management report, for example, or a management review or a strategic report. Some regulators require specific disclosures in certain parts of general purpose financial reports. So we use this generic phrase throughout the standards. So I noticed in the poll a few slides back, there didn't seem to be too many people who were familiar with the TCFD approach. So you'll hear us mention this a couple of times. So don't worry about it too much if you haven't seen it before. But for those of you who are familiar with TCFD, you'll probably recognize the same four core pillars or content areas for the ISSB standards. And that's simply because the TCFD recommendations heavily influence the development of the ISSB standards. And as you can see, these four areas are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And for each of the four areas, there are a key set of disclosures to be addressed, and the standards provide very detailed guidance on these individual requirements. And we'll run through all of this in the session today. So let me start by saying to anyone joining us today who is a preparer, don't be afraid. Yes, of course, there's a lot to understand. I don't deny it. But you might be surprised that some of the detail here is already familiar to you. I say this as a former preparer. Likewise, for any accountants with us today, you will also be relieved to see many of the same conceptual foundations which were originally developed by the IASB over the last 20 years have been incorporated into the ISSB standards. So some of the detail, some of the information will also be quite familiar to you. Okay, so if we start then with S1, or the full title is General Requirements, and I emphasize that, general requirements for disclosure of sustainability-related financial information. So IFRS S1 sets out these general requirements for the content and the presentation of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. S1 asks preparers to refer to and consider the applicability of the SASB standards and other sources of further guidance to identify sustainability-related risks and opportunities, and identify the material information. The SASB standards are organized by industry, type, or group, and that allows a company to identify these disclosure topics and the metrics that are applicable to business models and operations common across industry groups. And we'll come back to this a little bit later. And finally, the standards can be used in conjunction with any accounting requirements. The scope of S1 is all sustainability topics, except for climate, and that instead is covered by S2. Builds on the same foundations as S1. So, for example, it incorporates the recommendations of TCFD. It sets out the requirements for a company to disclose material information about climate-related risks and opportunities. And it requires the disclosure of both cross-industry and industry-specific information. So, in terms of climate risk, these include both physical risks and transition risks. And we'll talk about this a little bit later on today. Other specific climate-related disclosures are scenario analysis, and again, we'll come back to this, and reporting or disclosing GHG emissions. And preparers, like I said already, have to refer and consider the application of industry-based guidance. And a common question, Tiffany mentioned it earlier, actually, we often get is, can you use S1 or S2 individually? Well, they're not standalone standards. They're designed as a package, and they have to be applied together. And even if a company is only reporting or disclosing climate-related risks and opportunities, it has to apply S1 and S2. And that's simply because S1 sets out those general requirements for information, relevant information. And it sets out the requirements for that information to be decision useful for investors. So the fair presentation requirements for disclosure of relevant information about sustainability related risks and opportunities, while the faithful representation requirements require a complete and neutral and an accurate depiction or description of those risks and opportunities. One way I kind of talk about it or think about it sometimes here actually is the standards. If you pick them up and open them, S1 is about 45 pages long, and it's quite, so the scope of it's quite wide, but it doesn't go into a huge amount of detail. The depth is quite shallow, whereas S2 is also about 45 pages long, but the scope of it is much more narrow because it focuses only on climate. But the requirements in terms of the content or the scope is actually quite deep. So S1 is broad and S2 is narrow, but much more focused on climate-related issues. Let's then just, before we get into the specifics, also talk about some of the conceptual foundations that underpin the ISSB standards. And if you're coming from an accounting background, you'll know all this already, so forgive me, but I think it is important just to pause for a moment and remember there are others joining today's call who might not be familiar with these terms. So the concepts help us to understand how best to disclose information in order to meet the requirements of the standards. So to start with, one of the conceptual foundations is the requirement for a company to fairly present a complete set of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Fair presentation requires a disclosure of relevant information and its faithful representation. And to achieve this, companies shall provide a complete, a neutral, and an accurate description of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. The reporting entity concept under IFRS S1 requires the organizational boundary for sustainability-related information to be the same as for the financial statements. And another important concept is connected information. And we saw this earlier actually when Tiffany explained how the different risks are interconnected. The standards, the ISSB standards require companies to also talk about connections. So for example, the connections between risks and opportunities, the connections between each of the four content areas, and also the connections between the sustainability related risks and opportunities and the main financial statements as well. And I think Lois is going to take us through an example.
Yes, thank you, Jarlath. And as Tiffany said at the beginning, remember that the examples we share with you are really for inspiration. We're not suggesting that these examples are best or even good practice. They're just examples of what companies have done. And this example is to illustrate what Jarlath was just saying about connected information. The example comes from a company called BHP, their annual report of 2023, and BHP is a large mining company. So this example illustrates connections between the company's decarbonisation strategy and its financial results and processes. So what do we see being connected? Well, the first thing we see here is that the decarbonisation strategy is connected with the investment processes and decision-making of the company. So in the first paragraph, BHP says that all investment decisions consider the quantity of GHG emissions associated with the project, the cost per tonne of CO2 equivalent associated with the project, and the alignment with the group pathways to a net zero trajectory. So in summary, the investment decisions are connected with the decarbonisation strategy. And this makes sense, doesn't it? If a company's said publicly it's going to decarbonize, they also need to explain how they are going to invest to achieve that. The second thing we see being connected is the decarbonisation strategy and the various types of expenditure the company makes now and in the future. So you can see how much was spent on operational GHG emissions reductions in the reporting year. That's in the second paragraph there, which was US dollars 122 million. And in the next paragraph, we can see that the company anticipates spending $4 billion until 2030 on decarbonisation. Finally, we see a connection between the decarbonisation projects and the company's net present value. So in the penultimate paragraph, they tell us that based on current assumptions, the achievement of medium-term targets is expected to deliver positive net present value for the group, as it has done on already implemented projects. One other thing finally to notice about this example, at the bottom of the example, you see the orange text, which is navigating the reader to additional information about this. Back to you, Jarlath.
Thanks, Lois. Okay, we're going to move to the next poll. So the question is, what information should be considered for connected information? What information should be considered for connected information? And we have three options, and you can pick more than one. So the first option is governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. The second option is sustainability-related financial disclosures and financial statements. And the third option is sustainability-related risks and opportunities. I'm just going to give it another moment. And if you're struggling with this one, do have a look at the handout afterwards, and there's more information you can get there. Just a couple more. Oh. And as we can see, not too bad. So in this case, all answers were correct. So well done to everyone who chose all of those answers. Okay. Oh, sorry. My slides have just stopped moving. There we go. Super. Right, and then just to finish this, almost to finish this section, we talk about materiality, and this is a favorite topic of lots of people, and others are horrified by it. So the standards, the ISSB standards, are built on the concept of materiality as defined by the IFRS Foundation. And as a result, this materiality definition has been around for a long time. First developed by the IASB and then since incorporated by the ISSB for the sustainability standards. Now we'll go into in a bit more detail later on, but I just thought it might be helpful to flag it here. What we mean by material information is information that if omitted, if misstated, or if obscured, could reasonably be expected to affect investor decision making. And then finally here on additional guidance, when the exposure drafts were released last year, during the consultation period, one of the key feedback topics from people was on the importance of supporting preparers, and particularly those with more limited resources and those in emerging markets. In addition, therefore, to the standards on the application guidance that was published in 2023, a number of education resources were also released at that time. And since then, many more have followed. And Tiffany mentioned a couple of these earlier on, including the IFRS Knowledge Hub. And we'll talk about this a little bit later. We're also in the process of gathering examples and case studies provided by our partners, because everybody wants to see an example or a case study or a template. I do need to manage your expectations on the template. It's ultimately your story to tell, so we can't really tell you how to do it. There's loads of flexibility built into the standards, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. The SASB standards were aligned with IFRS S2 towards the end of last year, and that helps preparers who are looking for industry-based guidance. And the FSA credential was also updated, and with lots more stuff in the pipeline, and including a monthly webinar series that we have focusing on Africa actually this Thursday. And we'll put a link to the chat in a moment. And I should also note that the IFRS Foundation's capacity building program, which myself and Bella and Robert support, is a key part of our support to preparers, and the SSE training initiative is one of our most important deliverables. And then I'm going to finish with a poll here. So the question is, water is a vital input to your business. So say, for example, water is a vital input to your business, but the ISSB standards don't currently have a specific standard on water. What should you do? So we have 4 options here, and you pick one of the options. The first one is don't disclose anything about water. It's a vital input, but there's no standard there, no ISSB standard, so don't say anything about water. The second option is consult the sources of guidance listed by the ISSB standards. The third option is engage a consultant to help. And the fourth option is look at what your competitor is doing. So 4 options, and you can pick one of those. Okay, we have a clear winner here. Just share those results. 85%. Well done. Thank you very much for getting, I guess, the right answer. But there's also, interestingly, another option that could be available. Engaging a consultant is absolutely an appropriate option if you want. No harm in getting some expert advice. But also, you might want to check what your peers are doing. That's also a source of guidance, because they may have figured out an approach that applies to companies in your sector that's relevant for you to use, or at least to influence some of your thinking. So this is a kind of a trick question. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Fiona. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jarlath. Great. So before we wrap up this module, let's just take a few minutes to review what we've covered so far. So first, we reviewed the purpose of sustainability-related disclosures. And a key takeaway we hope you leave this workshop with is that there are important benefits, both internally and externally, for collecting and disclosing sustainability-related financial information. If you're not aiming to make good use of the data you're collecting to improve your strategic decision-making, you're going about this all wrong and potentially wasting your time. If you have operations in difficult to abate or high impact sectors, your competitors could disclose these risks and identify opportunities they're pursuing, leaving your investors wondering why you're lagging, and that might affect your ability to raise funds. Next, we looked at the evolution of disclosure standards, the formation of the ISSB, and the aim to simplify the landscape. And when you're thinking about other voluntary disclosures, you shouldn't see them as competing with the ISSB standards, but rather building on top of them. And finally, we introduce the standards and important concepts you need to understand in order to use the standards correctly. And a key point we want to reiterate here is that these standards and the guidance that comes with them are designed to meet the needs of investors, and therefore are heavily focused on the prospects that we discussed at the very start of the unit and that audience. So that just gives you a summary of what we have covered so far. So what we will move into now is a quick exercise just to wrap up this module. And this will be, again, in Menti. So we'll share the link again to that in the chat. And this also ties together with your homework assignment. So just an opportunity to start your thinking on this. And so really what we're looking to ask you to explore here is how are you going to build the capacity and identify the different individuals that you need for your disclosure. So some of the things that you might want to think about here would be the tone from the top. So thinking about who in your organization's leadership is going to have oversight for this. You might also want to think about integration. So which are the teams that you have already that might already be looking at sustainability risks and opportunities? And what skill sets perhaps do they need to build to help them do that better? And finally, there may, of course, be an element of negotiating. So you might need to work to build clearer consensus on the need to take action on this and to get in place the right resource to support that. So I will just move screens so that you have the link again to the Menti, and that I think will be shared in the chat with you again as well. But if you had the screen already open from before, it should be the next slide. So I will then share my screen so that you can see the results. Sorry, just bear with me 1 second. Great. So I see we've had some good responses into this already. I'll just give everyone a second to keep inputting there, and I'll maybe move the QR code so we can see all the answers. So some of the things we've had is to look at sharing feedback with the team. Yeah, that's definitely really important to share back what you're learning. Liaising with other departments, developing a checklist. Yeah, that sounds super helpful. Ensuring the team is trained and up to date. Conducting more training. Understanding your investor interest. Yeah, that's absolutely always a really helpful angle to take, I think. I'll just my screen. Oh, sorry, it's me. I have to scroll. I'm new to this. I was wondering why I wasn't refreshing, but we'll just scroll down and see a few more. So, interviewing your teams, doing a survey, doing a skills assessment. Yep, starting with your own capacity before you bring your team members in. I think that's a really good point to raise for sure, because obviously you want to make sure that you're well equipped to help those around you and that you build that trust as well. Lots of great responses here. Thank you for sharing all of those. So then we also have around conducting a benchmark against industry best practice, taking reviews from employees to look at different KPIs. Yeah, lots of brilliant ideas here. Conducting a thorough gap analysis and thinking about training for those gaps. So yeah, I think those are all some super great ideas. So feel free to keep sharing your thoughts on this board, as I'm sure those will really benefit others. And then again, we'll recap at the end, but in your homework, you'll also have the opportunity to look at this more closely. Great. So I think you captured a lot of the ideas really that we would recommend that you consider for this section. So definitely a gap analysis, as we discussed, is a really key place to start. So, you know, getting a clear and structured understanding of what's missing. And we mentioned already the SSE training tool on the ISSB. So that link will be available to you in the presentation materials, and that can be a really useful structure to help you with that gap analysis. And as you've all mentioned, educating your colleagues and particularly focusing on educating your leadership so that they're equipped to set the right tone from the top and support you in this will be really important as well. Great, so that wraps us up on this module. So I will hand over to Charlotte again for the next segment.
Thanks, Fiona. Okay. Now, on to module 2. So we've looked at the initial concepts. Let's start looking at applying the standards. We've got 2 units here. And the first one is applying the standards, and we'll come back to the second one in a little while. The first element here is on the first core content area is on governance. And as you would expect, this includes aspects that relate to the governance body in your organization, your company, and how management is applied. So for each of the core content areas, these 4 areas, what we'll do is talk about the questions that you can ask yourself in your own company to help you start identify the information that will support some of the disclosure requirements. So for example, in terms of a gap analysis that we heard about in the poll there. If we look at the governance and management requirements, we can see that there are several that are fairly qualitative. So for example, which bodies are responsible for the oversight and the management of processes, of controls and procedures around sustainability related risks and opportunities. For example, is management responsibility delegated to a specific officer or a committee of the board or of the exco, for example? How and where does that body or that group get informed about sustainability related risks and opportunities? How these issues then inform your business or your company's strategy, its decision making, and its overall risk management approach. And this could include setting targets to manage sustainability related risks and opportunities. And of course, you would expect to see whether progress is being made against these targets. And if there's a link to that between executive remuneration, that should also be disclosed. And for more information, you can have a look at the SSE checklist tool, as Tiffany mentioned earlier on. But remember, it's not, of course, a replacement for reading and using the full ISSB standards. So we've got a couple of examples lined up to see what some of this looks like in practice. And Lois is going to take us through that. Thanks, Lois.
Yes, thanks, Jarlath. The first example is from the AIB group, and AIB is a high street bank in Ireland, where Jarlath is from too, and it's got a lot of green and sustainable credentials, this bank, having committed a lot of funding to climate action and targeting 70% of their new lending to be green by 2030. So in terms of governance, what are they doing? Well, as we can see in this governance model, they have 3 board committees on risk, sustainable business, and audit. So there's separation between these committees, but of course also connection through the overall governance model. And in turn, each of those board committees is supported by an executive subcommittee and management. Of course, this is just one example of how a company can set up its governance model, and there are many other possibilities. But in this case, we see the 3 separate board committees supported by 3 separate executive committees and management support as well. In the next example, we're going to look at one from Toyota. And I'm sure you know that Toyota is a car manufacturer that had early adoption of hybrid electric vehicles, so has environmental credentials. This example is from one of the disclosures the company made in response to the TCFD recommendations to illustrate how governance is used to inform risk and strategy. So the first thing is we see the role of the board. So the example tells us what the board of directors do, what are their duties to deliberate and supervise strategies, make action plans, and so on. Then we see further on down in the penultimate paragraph what the board has done to inform strategy. So the governance is used to formulate long-term strategy, including the Toyota Environmental Challenge 2050, and in formulating and reviewing the medium to long-term targets and action plans. So we see here a connection between the governance model and the targets and action plans that are being set. Finally, in this example, we see what decisions the board has made, what actions they've actually taken, including their decision to invest in battery cars for battery electric vehicles. So there's an example of what the board does, what it does to inform a strategy, and what actions it takes. So I think I'm handing to you now, Tiffany.
That is correct. Thank you so much, Lois. And hopefully having a few of those examples does make it a bit clearer for everyone, not only what we're talking about, but also how it varies from one company to the next, how they disclose this information. So let's now move on to the strategy component. Now, strategy does have a few more disclosures than we just saw in governance, but I really think this is where a company can see the benefits from sustainability-related opportunities and being prepared for those risks. So I think this is really where we get to see the value of these disclosures. As you can see here, there are three kind of high-level areas that we focus on in the strategy content area, which are risks and opportunities, effects, so effects on the business model, on supply chain, effects on strategy, effects on financial impacts and cash flows, and resilience, which is particularly when we're looking at S2 or with climate. So as you're getting started, again, we want to come to a few questions you might want to start having internally. Remember that a lot of this, as Fiona talked us through in the first activity, has to do with colleagues and teams and negotiation. We need to start thinking differently within our organization, which means we need to involve more people. So starting out with asking some questions at the various levels of your organization can help. Now, just to note that IFRS S1 and S2 disclosure requirements on strategy are designed to enable users of general purpose financial reports to understand a company's strategy for managing sustainability related risks and opportunities. Now, if we first look at requirements related to sustainability related risks and those opportunities, these are some questions you might want to start with. So what risks and opportunities could reasonably be expected to affect a company's prospects? And how have those been identified? And over what time horizons, like short, medium, and long term, is that effect expected to occur? And then particularly for climate-related risks, is this a physical risk or a transition risk? And we'll go a little bit more into detail as to what that means a little bit later. Now, to help us look into that in a little bit more detail, let's come back to an example. And this one's from Goldfields, which is an integrated, it's their integrated annual report, and they're a diversified gold producer with mines in South Africa, in Australia, in Ghana, Chile, and Peru. And in this extract, what we can see on this particular image is which risks the company has identified, how they have identified them using a prioritization matrix, and how the risks align with strategic priorities and what mitigation policies the company's using in order to mitigate these risks. There's a lot more information in the report itself, but I think this quick little image helps us see kind of multiple stages of their strategic decision-making process. Now, I remember at the beginning when I was talking about time and how important time is when we're talking about sustainability-related risks and opportunities. Now, we also see in the strategy component, we're being asked to identify the risks and opportunities over certain time horizons, under short, medium, and long-term time horizons. Now, just to note that sounds quite vague, short, medium, and long term, and it is on purpose because it's up to you as an organization to identify what makes sense as a time horizon. So in order to do that, you'll be looking at things like investment and business cycles, strategic planning horizons, the life of assets, and even other aspects that you might want to consider. I think what's important to remember is that the time horizons indeed have to be defined. So don't expect investors to know what you're talking about. If you say over the short term, we expect XYZ to transpose, what does short term mean? And make sure to communicate that, and make sure that short term, medium term, and long term makes sense for your particular business, the business cycles, the planning horizons, etc. Now, let's move on to the second kind of big grouping we had in the strategy category. So the first grouping of strategy disclosures was relating to what are those risks and those opportunities that could be reasonably expected to affect a company's prospects. The next kind of larger category of disclosure requirements focus on what exactly those effects are and where it occurs in the business. So to start tackling the disclosure requirements of the standard, companies might want to start asking themselves questions such as, how can they describe these effects? And how can they understand the response planned for mitigating or adapting to the effects that have been identified from sustainability-related risks and opportunities? Again, I think an example helps with this. So let's look at another example. This one here is from a global chemical producer, and it's from their 2023 annual report. And this company acknowledges that their strategy is highly affected by the changing climate, by scarcity of natural resources, by pressure on ecosystems, and also a growing population. And as we discussed in the first set of questions for strategy, they were able to show here which risks and opportunities they expect to affect their company's prospects. But furthermore, they explain these effects and how they're and where they're affecting their business. Interestingly, they say that their business, which is a reminder, it's chemistry, has actually a key role to play in addressing these challenges that have been identified, including through innovation, through using new materials more efficiently, through reducing waste and enabling healthy food production, and for example, through climate smart mobility. So as well as the changes they hope that chemistry will offer society and the economy, the company itself will need to undergo profound changes as this environment is changing around them. So these transformations that they identify within their company and throughout their value chain are shown in this little excerpt that we took here, where we can see that the company's supply chain, its production, and its products will all be affected by these transformations. Now, sometimes one of the obstacles that companies face when reporting on these particular effects is to what detail they should be disclosing information. So in the example we just looked at, we were showed mostly qualitative disclosures and descriptions. But what about quantitative disclosures? So a company is required to disclose both quantitative and qualitative, so both numbers and descriptions about current, right now, and anticipated in the future financial effects of sustainability-related risks and opportunities. However, the standard does set out certain criteria when only qualitative information, only a description is required. So let's look at what those circumstances are so that you can figure out where you are and how much information you should be providing. So when you're discussing both current and anticipated financial effects, so those happening now and those in the future, you can use only qualitative information if, for example, the company cannot separate those effects of a climate-related risk or opportunity from other effects. Remember those connections we were talking about earlier? Or if there's a high level of measurement uncertainty. So if we can't separate them out clearly, quantitatively, or the measurement is not able to be quite clear and effective, then we can explain that that's the reasoning and we're using a description instead. Also, and when we're only talking about not current effects, but anticipated, so future effects, if the company does not have the skills or capabilities or resources to provide that quantitative information, they can also state that and provide only a description, only qualitative information. Now, we do have another example in your handout. I'm not going to go through it today, but you might want to check that out in your handout in the slides on the website. But I think I want to go on to this last grouping of disclosures in the strategy component, which is really looking at the resilience of a company, how it's going to survive these changes and thrive, hopefully, through these changes. So this really gets into the practices and the processes that a company has in place to assess its own resilience and to make strategic adjustments when needed. So disclosures include information on what type of assessment is used to determine resilience and how a climate scenario analysis is used. And at the heart of it, resilience disclosures really ask the company to disclose its assessment of climate resilience and its input. So how did it make that assessment? What information did it use? What assumptions did it make in order to make that assessment? Remember that when we're talking about resilience, we're really looking in the future, fairly far in the future often. So what assumptions or what data or facts or science are you using in order to do that? Now, we will dive a lot more deeply into scenario analysis a little bit later. But let's again look at another couple examples to make this a bit more clear. So this example here is from Stora Enso, which is a Finnish and Swedish forestry product company. And they show in this little diagram on the top right-hand side of the slide there, what sales are likely to look like in 2030. So Stora Enso distinguishes between essential and growth business in this very small, but I think quite powerful infographic, because we can see that their growth businesses in 2030 will make up 80% of their sales. And we don't really have concrete numbers here. We just have percentages and very vague percentages, I think, but we have already an immediate picture of where growth is anticipated. And then we also get detail about the company's long-term vision and their recent transition, which they describe as, in quote, proactively repositioning the business. So initially they were seen as a pulp and paper company, and now they are repositioning themselves as a renewable material company, ensuring that their future is clear and stable for many more years to come. So they don't just leave it at this diagram. They give a lot more details within their text, but I think it's important to show that they're indicating their resilience moving forward. Now, let's also look at this one from Solvay. Now, Solvay is a Belgian multinational chemical company, and we're using this example just to illustrate how they discuss these the reporting of their financial effects and how they discuss their resilience as an organization. So in particular, what I want to highlight here is how they are really quite transparent about the estimates that they've made, and they note exactly how they did that. As I was saying, if you're going to use well, you should be using a scenario analysis, you're expected to, but you have to explain how you're doing it. What is the scenario you used? What are the assumptions you made? So they explain well kind of what scenario they were looking at, and that they worked with an external consulting firm that worked together with their team. And they explained exactly what were the assumptions in that scenario. And they particularly break down then kind of 3 business units that they assessed, because those were business units that they thought were at high risk. So maybe let's go through just one of those business units. Let's look at the soda ash business, which we have a little clip there. It's the first point in that second paragraph there. So for those who don't know, soda ash is a key ingredient in our really everyday life. It's found in windows, it's found in rechargeable batteries, it's found in detergents and many other things. And soda ash came to be in the 1860s when Ernst Solvay invented the process to produce it. And even now, 160 years later, it's the preferred way of producing soda ash. But this process is very carbon intensive. So it made sense that they looked at that business unit and did a scenario analysis. And they've now indicated that they're developing a new lower carbon way of developing soda ash. And they identified a few key highlights. First, using that scenario analysis, they noted that the cost of raw materials could significantly impact their margin. So they estimated that at about 16% in a 1.5-degree scenario. They also noted that there would be, however, an increase in demand for glass for high efficiency buildings, for example, which was then they thought likely to make up for this 16% impact in their margin. So it's going to cost them more to produce the product, but they think they'll have a lot more demand for the product. What they did show then is that they have a great opportunity here to be able to lower those margins and to be able to produce these products more efficiently and more effectively. And so that's why they're investing in low carbon technology to be able to capture that growing market and so many needs for this particular product, but doing it in a way that's not going to be as expensive and carbon intensive as it currently is. Great. So with that, I'm going to now do one Zoom poll here with you. So this one is, I think we just moved one to, someone's changing the slide. So I'm just gonna, there we go. Perfect. So I'm just gonna ask a quick quiz of all of you. So a company may choose to disclose only qualitative or descriptive information, or a combination of quantitative and qualitative information about current, now, and anticipated future risks or financial effects of risks and opportunities. In which situation? Remember, we just discussed this before our examples. First option is they can't be separated. The second option is there's a high level of measurement uncertainty. And the third option is that that information might shed negative light on your company. I'll give you just 30 more seconds to fill that in, and you can pick as many options as you wish. Okay, so I think you've all been listening very well. I'm going to share the results there. Yeah, the first two indeed were right. We had mentioned that. The third one is not correct. So if information sheds negative light on your company, that's certainly not a reason to not disclose it. That's actually probably something that investors are already looking into. So what you'd rather do is share that information and explain what you're doing about it. Like we just saw in that example before from Solvay, who, yeah, it's going to have an impact. There's going to be a significant impact on their margins from climate change. Actually, a 16% impact they showed quantitatively. However, they're doing something to manage that, and they think that they can actually come out ahead by managing that particular effect. Great. So with that, I'm going to pass on to my colleague Fiona, who's going to look at the climate aspect in more detail. So over to you, Fiona.
Great, thank you, Tiffany. And I'm sure everyone will agree those examples were really useful to bring some of this to life. So as Tiffany mentioned, we're just going to take a brief look at climate-specific considerations in reporting. And I know from the early poll that we did, it sounded like not so many of you are using the TCFD to report on climate-related financial disclosure at the moment. So we'll cover this in a brief way, but there'll be some more materials available to you in the presentation as well to look at in your own time. So the governance requirements in the S1 and S2 standards are very similar, with no specific additional requirements for climate. But there is a little bit more to say on strategy. So there's some considerations here, which, as I said, we won't go into detail on, but I'll leave with you to consider in your own time. However, one thing that may be worth mentioning is the concept of transition planning as a new element that's going to require particular focus. So the IFRS S2 standard also requires you to disclose any climate-related transition plans you may have, although there isn't a requirement to prepare a plan, just to disclose one if you have one. So let's take a brief look at what transition plans are and what work we're undertaking to support them. So transition plans are an aspect of the company's overall strategy that includes targets, actions, or resources for the transition towards net zero. So that includes, for example, your greenhouse gas emissions reduction plans. So an aspect of your overall strategy is this transition plan, but it's important to bear in mind that the transition plan must be aligned with and integrated into the overall business strategy. And that includes the business case and the motivation for transition, the levers of your company's strategy that are most suited to supporting the transition and decarbonisation. The transition plan should also be aligned to science, so including what science says about the requirements for net zero to be achieved and how your decarbonisation trajectory is aligned to the Paris goals explained in terms of science. So the plan must include long-term transition goals supported by activities and targets to achieve those goals in the nearer term, and interim targets to monitor progress. So getting that balance of having a clear long-term direction for how you'll be net zero, but also having enough specificity in the short and medium term about the steps that you'll be taking along the way and not leaving it all to come down the road. So given the uncertainty surrounding the transition, there are various ways that scenarios may play out in the future in terms of policies, energy costs, geopolitical shifts, for example. The plan should be transparent about the dependencies. So it should consider potential areas of progress and success, the risks and challenges that might be faced in implementing the plan, and where you may expect to have any residual emissions that are hard to abate. You should also consider in the plan how you're going to handle those. So, for example, potentially through offsetting, but only as a last resort for residual emissions. The transition is going to proceed in different ways across different sectors, of course, as well. So considering sector-specific pathways in your plan will also be really important to inform its development. And we're going to look at a few resources available for that in a moment. And finally, you should be considering within your transition plan how it might be evaluated by investors and others, and ensuring that you have a clear hallmark of credibility in the plan and a good mechanism as well to take on board any feedback that you may receive from your stakeholders to improve the plan as well. So to get started on transition planning, there are a whole host of resources that you can start looking at, and we'll run through a few of those now. So for more detail, you can look at our SSE training tool on transition plans. We'll share a link to that in the chat shortly, and you can also find it on our website under publications. So GFANZ, the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, is another key body in this space, and they set out expectations that companies can use to develop their pathways. So I'd recommend taking a look at the work of GFANZ as well. The Transition Plan Task Force obviously is quite key here as well. So they have developed a disclosure framework which provides additional guidance alongside the ISSB on the specific disclosure of transition pathways. So the TPT was launched in the UK in 2022, and it brought together leaders from industry, academia, regulators to develop a good practice approach on transition plans. And that considered plans for both financial organisations, but also those in the real economy and different industrial sectors as well. So it's important to note that the IFRS Foundation has now assumed responsibility for the disclosure-related materials of the Transition Plan Task Force. And so this, again, is as part of bringing these things together. And those materials will be updated in due course to further promote more alignment between them as well. And thank you for sharing that link as well, Tiffany. So with that, we will now take a short break, which I'm sure everyone will enjoy having a quick moment to step away from the desks, take a cup of coffee, etc. So we'll reconvene in 5 minutes and see you back here shortly. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I think we have Landon taking us off from this point. Landon, you good to go?
Yes, all good. Thank you, Tiffany. One second, folks, as the slides don't want to change for me right now, so please give me 1 second.
Landon, if you like, I can change the slides for you.
Okay, please. Yeah, I'm not sure why my computer's acting up, but thanks so much. So welcome back from the break, everyone. It's great to be with you here today. And for now, we want to move on to the next core content area of risk management. And as you can see at the high level here, this category of disclosure requires report preparers to disclose information on their processes for risk management, for sustainability related risks and opportunities, as well as for how those fit within their overall risk portfolio. So let's dig a bit deeper into this category. And as a reminder, in the strategy content area, we were also talking about sustainability related risks and opportunities, with a focus on the risks and opportunities that could be reasonably expected to affect a company's prospects. In the risk management disclosures, the focus now turns to how exactly a company identifies those material risks and assesses different risks and opportunities more broadly. So a company is required to disclose information about the processes and related policies for risk management. So a firm might need to start asking questions internally about things like inputs and parameters for risk management, whether and how sustainability related risks and opportunities are prioritized, how the nature, likelihood, and magnitude of risks and opportunities are assessed, how sustainability related risks and opportunities are monitored, and whether and how processes have changed since the last reporting period. Beyond these, the standards also ask about the extent to which and how all of this has been integrated into the company's overall risk management process. So looking at climate considerations, as with strategy, there's certain considerations in S2 that build on what S1 requires for risk management. So, for example, you'll have to provide more details on the inputs that are used to identify and assess risks, on scenario analysis used, and on any changes to the risk management processes. S2 also requires more details on opportunities, as these are not discussed in TCFD to the same extent. Now, part of identifying risks is being aware of what risks and opportunities being aware of what risks and opportunities you should be evaluating to begin with. TCFD specified types of climate-related risks and opportunities, as well as examples of the financial effects they might lead to, such as transition risks and physical risks. First, transition risks arise from efforts to transition to a lower carbon economy and are often categorized as policy and legal, technological, market, and reputational risks. These risks could carry financial implications for a company, such as increased operating costs or even asset impairment due to climate-related regulations. And the company's financial performance could also be affected by shifting consumer demands and the development and deployment of new technology. On the other side, physical risks include risks from climate change that can be event-driven, such as acute physical risks, or from longer-term shifts in climate patterns, also known as chronic physical risk. Acute physical risks arise from weather-related events such as storms, floods, droughts, or heat waves, which are increasing in severity and frequency. Now, chronic physical risks arise from longer-term shifts in climatic patterns, including changes in precipitation and temperature, which lead to sea level rise, reduced water availability, biodiversity loss, and changes in soil productivity. These risks could also carry financial implications for a company, such as costs resulting from direct damage to assets or indirect effects of supply chain disruption. The company's financial performance could also be affected by changes to resource availability, extreme temperature changes, and employees' health and safety. Now, on the other hand, there are also climate-related opportunities, which refer to the potential positive effects arising from climate change for a company. For example, efforts to mitigate and adapt to climate change can produce climate-related opportunities such as innovation in operations, improving processes, resource efficiency, use of lower emission sources of energy, and supportive policy incentives, just to name a few. If your company identified and disclosed a risk or opportunity, it might benefit from a first mover advantage. An investor could look at your sector, see your disclosure, and wonder why your competitors have not identified or sought to mitigate that risk or capitalize on the same opportunity. This could have positive financial and reputational effects. Now, I'll turn it over to Jarlath to provide an example.
Thanks, Landon. Okay, NATS is the UK air navigation service provider, handling UK domestic and North Atlantic air traffic control. This might come across as a strange example, but it's actually quite helpful in this context. Many of us will already know how bad weather causes delays for airlines and airports, and of course us as passengers. And this can often lead to increased CO2 emissions because aircraft are flying around in circles, in holes, or even if you're very lucky, you might get diverted if the airspace becomes congested and inefficient. Now, climate change is already driving increased frequency and severity of bad weather events, and that might include, for example, thunderstorm activity and even turbulence. While on the ground, extreme weather includes temperatures, flooding, and winter storms, which all affect airports and the network infrastructure that the industry relies on. However, longer-term changes in climate patterns may influence the jet stream, which could shorten times for some intercontinental journeys. This disclosure example here provides important details on how this particular risk was assessed and how it was deemed to be material for NATS stakeholders. Building physical and operational resilience will need to be addressed both in its strategy and in its long-term investment plans. Okay, so then moving on to core metrics and targets. We'll spend a little bit of time looking at this, and we'll start with metrics. And again, we're thinking about the questions you might want to ask yourself in your company to pull this kind of information together. Requirements on metrics are designed to help investors to understand your company's performance in relation to sustainability risks and opportunities. That's the whole point. Preparers must disclose information explaining how the metrics you have prepared are defined. If, for example, if they're absolute or relative, if they've been validated by a third party, as well as the methodology that underpins that metric. So, for example, what's the method of calculation? What were the inputs? Are there any limitations? And importantly, what kind of assumptions are involved? Now let's move on to the second part, which is targets. And again, requirements on targets are designed to help investors understand the targets your company has set to monitor progress towards achieving your strategic goals. And the disclosures here include whether, for example, the targets are qualitative or quantitative, and whether they've been set voluntarily, or in some cases by law or regulation. As well, the metric used to set the target and to monitor progress towards achieving it. The baseline, so when does the target apply from, and the target year, when do you hope to achieve it? And in some cases, as we know, emissions targets are set quite far out in advance, and as a result, it's not unusual to see interim targets or milestones along the way to keep track of progress. And of course, if you've made any changes or revisions to the target for whatever reason, that should be disclosed with an explanation. And Lois, I think, is going to take us through an example.
Yes, this is an example from a company called ArcelorMittal. It's their 2022 annual report we take this example from, and ArcelorMittal is a multinational steel manufacturing and mining corporation. So this example is to illustrate how the company links their strategy with their metrics, targets, and assumptions. So what do we see in this extract? First of all, that the company has an ambition in the first sentence there, and their ambition is to have a leadership position within the steel industry in terms of target setting, performance, and disclosure. And they also have an ambition to achieve net zero steelmaking globally by 2050, as you can see at the end of the first paragraph. So what targets do they set to achieve that ambition? Well, the targets that we see in the second paragraph under the title Decarbonisation Strategy are to reduce the company's carbon emissions intensity by 25% globally and 35% in Europe by 2030. So they tell us they've got different targets for different regions. They then tell us the scope of the targets. So both targets cover scopes 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions for steel and mining per tonne of crude steel. We also know from this disclosure from the first paragraph that ArcelorMittal has a roadmap for achieving their medium-term 2030 targets, and they set that roadmap in 2021. What else can we tell from this little extract? We can also tell that they have an investment plan, an anticipated gross investment of approximately $10 billion to help achieve their targets. The other things we can take from this small example are the types of dependencies for success that the company has. So in order to achieve its aims, as well as the investment and the plan, they need policy making and a supportive regulatory framework. And in this extract, the company also sets out its assumptions behind the plan to deliver. So there's more about this example in the handout, and I'm going to hand back to Jarlath.
Thanks, Lois. And as Lois said, yeah, there's another example in the handout. You can have a look at it afterwards. And that takes us on then to some climate-specific considerations on metrics and targets. Now, we're going to skip through the TCFD slides. Don't worry, you'll have them afterwards in your pack. But because there's relatively few people who've used TCFD, we're just going to move forward to something that I think we should be all familiar with, but let's just make sure. Because questions on greenhouse gas emissions do often come up in relation to metrics and targets. So let's just briefly look at this. For anyone who's not familiar with the terminology here, Scope 1 includes all direct emissions that occur from sources owned by or controlled by your company. For example, emissions from your company's facilities or vehicles. Scope 2 includes emissions from the generation of acquired and consumed electricity, steam, heat, and cooling. Obviously, for example, the electricity that you purchase. And then Scope 3 includes essentially everything else upstream or downstream indirect emissions that occur right across your value chain. And this all derives from the GHG protocol, which has been around for over 20 years, I think 23 years. S2, the ISSB standard S2 requires the company to disclose its absolute gross Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions in accordance with the GHG protocol, unless, and this is important, unless you are in a jurisdiction which requires you to use a different methodology for whatever reason. And if you're using a different methodology, there's a transition relief to allow you an extra year to transition to using the GHG protocol. The standards also look for disclosure around whether your company is using an internal price on carbon to help or support decision making. And as mentioned, I think a little bit earlier, whether and how executive remuneration is linked to climate change. And Lois is now going to take us through another example.
Yes, this example is from the 2022 sustainability report of a company called Enel, and Enel is an Italian manufacturer and distributor of electricity and gas. This example shows us how Enel reports its greenhouse gas emissions and how it disaggregates or breaks down that information to make it more understandable to the reader. So at the top of the page, we can see the company's carbon footprint that's broken down by scopes 1 and 2 emissions. So in the pale green bars, we see the emissions for 2021, and the darker green bars, we see the emissions for 2022. So we can see the total direct scope 1 emissions across the years, scope 2 emissions, and the indirect scope 3 emissions and the total. So we get the breakdown of the scopes of emissions there. At the bottom of the page, you can see how the scope 1 emissions are broken down between the company's business lines, so their generation, trading, and networks activities, and so on. And you can see from the green bars there, you can immediately that the majority of scope 1 emissions come from the generation from thermal sources, so from combustion of fuels in generation activities. The green bars tell us that immediately. Now you can see at the top of the little bars, you've got numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and these numbers refer to notes. So when we look at the notes to this illustration, we can see that the majority of the scope 1 emissions from generation from thermal sources were from carbon dioxide, but there were also some methane and other gases included. The little dots that we see, the coloured dots, refer to whether and to what extent the greenhouse gas source is considered within a science-based target initiative. So this little diagram tells you so much about the amount of emissions, the type of emissions, the type of gas, the source, the trend over 2 years, and whether the emission sources were considered within a science-based targets initiative target. So I think we're going to have a Zoom poll next. So hopefully one of the colleagues will look. Thank you very much. Hopefully you can see that. And the question asks, what is the objective of metrics? Is it to enable report users to understand the company's performance in relation to its sustainability-related risks and opportunities? Is it to understand the company's progress towards targets? Or is it to understand the company's assumptions for the future? This is a multiple choice question, so please select as many as you think apply. Lots of great participation here. Right, we've got a pattern emerging, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. And you'll see that the majority of you answered the first two. So the metrics are to understand the company's performance in relation to its risks and opportunities and to understand progress towards targets. Now you are right. If you answered the first two, you're right. Of course, I can understand why many of you answered that it helps understand the company's assumptions for the future, and that may well be true. But the point of asking you the question in this way is to help you understand how the standards have been crafted. So in paragraph 45 of IFRS S1 about metrics and targets, you will see that it starts by saying the objective of sustainability disclosures on metrics and targets is to. And it says to enable users of general purpose financial reports to understand an entity's performance in relation to its sustainability related risks and opportunities and progress towards any targets. So we've asked you this question to help you understand that at the beginning of each of the requirements in the standards, there is an objective that's set out. So well done to those of you that answered the first two. You can understand why you answered 3, but it's not exactly what the standard says. So do have a read of the standards, as Jarlath said earlier. And I'm now going to hand on to Fiona to take us through the next section.
Thanks, Lois. Brilliant. So with that, we've now covered all of the core content areas of disclosure that meet the ISSB standards. So congratulations for making it to this point in the training. However, as you're all aware, there are often also regulatory requirements that cover additional disclosures that you need to consider, and those may come from other stakeholders as well. So this final section of Align, as the unit we're in, will cover some of this briefly on additional disclosures. Sorry. So many companies already disclose against voluntary and mandatory reporting standards based on their jurisdiction, their stock exchange regulations, and wider industry norms. And these can include things like local reporting requirements. So these could both be for listed companies and non-listed companies who need to understand and comply with jurisdiction-specific disclosure requirements. Companies in your supply chain or value chain would also need to be prepared to provide information to you to support these if they're requested. Then policy objectives. So companies also need to familiarize themselves with policy objectives aimed at promoting sustainability. So governments might offer incentives like tax cuts or subsidies for sustainable practices. And conversely, they might also implement some disincentives for any activities that are counter to national sustainability objectives. Companies also need to provide additional disclosures to align with emerging industry practices and effectively manage sustainability-related risks and opportunities that depend on their particular sector. And finally, companies should also think about their other stakeholders and what requirements that they may have in terms of sustainability information. And you can consider that through sustainability materiality assessments that will ensure you're kind of comprehensively meeting the needs of those different stakeholder groups. So you can definitely expect your national regulator to consider how the ISSB standard sits alongside pre-existing disclosure requirements, and that may well involve public consultation. So far, we've seen more than 20 jurisdictions that have already decided to use or are taking steps towards introducing the ISSB standards into their legal or regulatory frameworks. And together, these jurisdictions actually account for around 55% of global GDP or 40% of global market capitalization. And by another metric, more than half of global GHG emissions. So you can see there's already been quite widespread commitment to adoption of the standards into regulatory requirements. And you can find out some more information about this if you refer to the regulatory implementation program available on the IFRS website as well, if you want to keep track of where the latest implementations are up to. So on the voluntary side of reporting standards, the IFRS is actively supporting jurisdictions and non-jurisdictional stakeholders to ensure that the ISSB global baseline meets investor needs and has good interoperability. The hope here will be that that reduces duplication and improves efficiency of the reporting system. So many of the decisions taken to develop the ISSB standards have also helped to advance interoperability. So, for example, using the TCFD architecture as the basis of the standards, in terms of that structure of governance, strategy, etc., that we've talked about, that facilitates interoperability with existing disclosure requirements. CDP is another key partner here, and they work closely with the ISSB as their disclosure partner. And in 2024, we saw the CDP Climate Chess Questionnaire on Climate being aligned with the IFRS S2 standard as well. The IFRS is also working very closely with GHG protocol, the GRI, and some of those other organisations you see on the screen to progress that question of interoperability. So if we take a look at the detail on a few of these initiatives, so the IFRS and GRI are, of course, looking to ensure maximum interoperability in their approaches to facilitate efficient and effective reporting around the world. So we're going to drop into the chat, hopefully a link to some recent mapping that's been done on this topic, and a source where you can find some more information on the Sustainability Innovation Lab project. And then if we look at the ESRS, so the IFRS and EFRAG, which is the European Reporting Advisory Group, which sets European reporting standards, IFRS and EFRAG have been working closely to support interoperability between their standards as well. So, for example, this has included mapping each IFRS S2 paragraph to the relevant ESRS paragraph. And there will be many companies who are going to be expected to choose, or perhaps maybe required to apply both the ESRS, the European standards, and the ISSB standards. And as jurisdictions around the world will introduce ISSB as a global baseline, companies are going to be better prepared to meet disclosure requirements globally by setting that baseline through the ISSB. And the high degree of alignment that we see between the ISSB standards and the ESRS will reduce complexity and duplication for companies who are applying both. So the ISSB is really focused at that decision useful information for capital markets and enabling a global comparison for investors, whereas the ESRS builds on top of that and goes a bit further. So joint guidance has been published, as I mentioned, by IFRS and EFRAG that focuses kind of practically on supporting that question and helping to companies to comply with both sets of standards. And if we turn to integrated reporting, so the integrated reporting framework provides a principles-based guidance for reporting structure and content. When it's used together with the ISSB standards, including its different sources of guidance, the IR framework can support a holistic view of value creation, looking across governance and business model disclosures and driving that connectivity between financial statements and sustainability-related financial disclosure that investors are really keen to see. So as a result of this, the IR framework is a kind of a key supporter of high quality corporate reporting. But of course, it's not just integrated reporting that we need, but integrated thinking as well. And so it's really important that you're working hard with your colleagues in different functions to think about that integration of sustainability issues into core strategy and governance. And hopefully reciprocally, that can really help to improve the quality of your company's corporate governance as well. So we'll move back to another Zoom poll now, just to get your thoughts on setting disclosure objectives and how you can combine the ISSB and other requirements. So the question we have here is, what should your disclosure objectives consider? So just the ISSB standards, the ISSB standards and regulatory requirements, just the regulatory requirements, or the regulatory requirements and other sources of guidance. So I'll just give you a second to respond to that poll. I see the responses coming through with a key front runner, I think, at the moment in the responses. Great. Looks like most of you have had the opportunity to do that. So we'll just share the results with you there. So you'll see here that the vast majority selected the final option, the ISSB standards, regulatory requirements, and other sources of requirements, sources of guidance should be considered. And that's correct. We'd absolutely recommend taking a rounded approach to this and aiming to consider both that global perspective of the baseline, what your national regulator requires, and then those other sources of guidance, for example, voluntary frameworks and stakeholder requirements as well. So you're doing your best to serve those different needs and take a comprehensive approach. Great. So if we move on now, this will bring us towards wrapping up our module 2 that we're in currently. And before we do so, I just want to take a minute to remind ourselves of what we've covered in this module. So we reviewed all 4 of the core content areas of the ISSB standards. So that's governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. But what is important to remember here is that these content areas do not operate in silos. And we saw that in the examples that we talked about, that despite them having 4 separate categories of disclosure, potentially, all of this information is, of course, connected. We also discussed how your disclosure might go beyond the requirements of S1 and S2. So, for example, how you might meet the needs of different stakeholders, how you might consider regulatory requirements in certain jurisdictions, or also look at industry standards. And what's important to remember when you're doing this is that the ISSB standards have been purposefully developed to act as a baseline, and the building blocks approach allows report preparers to add additional disclosures on top. But in doing so, report preparers need to be careful not to obscure the requirements of S1 and S2. Brilliant. So that just wraps us up on that module. And we do have a bit of time now to go into a second exercise in Menti. So hopefully you should still have the Menti link open from previously, but that will be shared again in the chat so that you have access to that again if you need to remind yourself where to find that. So what we're going to consider in this exercise is what are the tools that you're really going to need to conduct this gap analysis that we discussed earlier? So we all know that that's a great place to start in understanding those gaps and thinking about what you need to do about them. But actually, what's the information that you need to support that? And what are the resources that you're going to need to draw upon to support you in that exercise? And that might also be a case of considering where you already have reporting, where you need to improve that and how you go about it. So I'll just share a reminder there of the menti.com link, and Tiffany has shared the specific link in the chat as well, thank you. And then I will share screens with you all so you can see the results coming in. We have had the tool open for a little while, so some of you have already been sharing your thoughts in there, which has been super helpful to see. But do take a moment to share your responses, and then I will start sharing my screen so you can see what others are saying. Great, I see some answers coming through here already, so that's great to see. So here we see questionnaires and surveys, the gap analysis tool, attending a panel discussion webinar on sustainability, getting ESG audited by both external and internal auditors. Yeah, I think that's such a good suggestion because your auditors, both externally and internally, have a really good eye to that accounting perspective that the ISSB brings in with its alignment with the IFRS foundation. So getting an auditor view on this, I think, is a super helpful place to help you to structure how you go about this. Just scroll along and see what else we've got. So we have materiality assessment tools, stakeholder feedback mechanisms. Yes, absolutely. So looking at what you're hearing from those stakeholders that you have already and thinking about, you might be able to use that feedback. So For example, if you, if you see what kind of questions come up at your AGM, or what's coming through in analyst or proxy reports, that should give you a good sense of what's material to that investor audience that we're focused on here in the ISSB standards. But also, if you look at wider things like employee engagement surveys, any kind of civil society engagement that your organization has, that can help you to understand any of those voluntary reporting frameworks and requirements that you may also want to consider. Great, so we've got checklists, SWOT analysis, great, lots of really good ideas here, and a lot of consensus, I think, on approach. So that's always good to know and get that reassurance that we're going about it in the same way. So PEST, I think we mean by political, economic, social, and technical assessment. Yeah, that's a really good approach to getting a comprehensive view of those risks and opportunities for your organization. Consulting a consultant, yeah, absolutely, can always be quite helpful to get that external perspective from those organizations that are working with many companies on this topic to hear what they would recommend. Looking at your current reporting against the checklist, definitely. Yeah, attending workshops and webinars. So exactly what we're here to do today. So we're all doing a great thing already by being here to talk about this together. And then I see lots more on the checklists front, SWOT analysis, checklists, brilliant. Great, thank you so much for sharing all of those. So I will stop sharing just there. And I think actually you captured a lot of the ideas that we would recommend there. But definitely, I guess I would just highlight, in addition to that, some of the guidance documents that we've mentioned already that sit alongside the S1 and S2 standards. So each of those has guidance associated that can be very helpful. Looking at those mapping documents that we've mentioned already and will be available in the resources that we share the links to with you afterwards. And those mapping documents help you to see how the different standards compare to each other. And of course, I think we've talked about some peer examples already, but obviously looking at some peers that are particular to your region or your industry sector can be a really helpful way to benchmark where you're at as well, and to gain some perspectives from other organizations. Excellent. So thank you everyone for the great engagement with that exercise, and do feel free to keep sharing further ideas as well in the Menti offline. And I will now hand you over to Landon for the next segment.
Great, thanks so much, Fiona. So now that we've outlined the detailed content required for disclosure, let's look a bit more practically at how that is done, starting with the practices and processes needed to collect the appropriate data for disclosure. So in this unit, we'll cover 3 topics that are key to collecting sustainability-related information. And as I mentioned, this unit will cover in more detail the how aspect. To kick us off on this unit, let's first look at how to identify sustainability-related risks and opportunities. So IFRS S1 asks companies to provide material information on all sustainability-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect a company's prospects. IFRS S2 sets out the requirements for climate-related disclosures. So what about risks and opportunities beyond climate? Well, S1 directs companies to sources of guidance to support the identification of risks and opportunities, and information to disclose about other risks and opportunities. First, when identifying which sustainability risks and opportunities to report on beyond climate, S1 says that consideration must be given to the SASB standards. In addition, companies may consider other materials, including industry practice and materials of other investor-focused standard setters. Then, after a company has identified which sustainability-related risks and opportunities to provide information about, S1 supports companies in identifying what information to disclose. Here, S1 says again, a company must consider the SASB standards. In addition, a company may consider other sources, including the GRI standards and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards. Now, an example of this is Yara. So Yara is an international global crop nutrition company. Yara's report here provides an example of linking megatrends such as population growth and geopolitical and trade uncertainties to sustainability-related risks and opportunities. For example, they note that the climate crisis is set to put food systems under extreme pressure, affecting agricultural production globally. So there are increased expectations for and regulations related to tangible climate actions and the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which they then translate into risks, including regulatory changes, consumer demand for sustainability, and optimized fertilizer use can lead to lower fertilizer demand growth. Environmental costs and taxes can increase costs, physical climate change risks to their operations and customers, amongst others. They also show the opportunities, which include, for example, digital tools to enable new market channels and reduce the yield gap through farmer connectivity, mainstream adoption of clean ammonia and hydrogen, focus on soil health, water use, and biodiversity, where optimal fertilizer use has a positive impact, and new monetization opportunities from increased data access. We have one more example here, and that's of Neste. So this is an extract from Neste's 2023 annual report. Neste is a company based in Finland. It's a leading producer of sustainable aviation fuel, renewable diesel, and feedstock solutions for the chemical industry. It uses science and tech to transform waste and other resources into renewable fuels and circular raw materials. The company aims to help its customers reduce their GHG emissions through the use of their fuels and products. They call this their carbon handprint, i.e., which offers solutions and opportunities to their customers. You can read more about that in their annual report. And to reduce its own carbon emissions, also known as their footprint, and reach carbon neutral production by 2035. So this extract comes from the climate section of the company's annual report, as mentioned, and it shows how this company identifies both risks and opportunities in 3 different temperature scenarios: 1.5, 2, and 2.5 to 3 degrees, and over a time horizon all the way to 2050. The extract shows an overall assessment of whether the scenario is positive or otherwise for the company, and the indicative financial effect. Because of their business model, which is focused on development of renewable fuels and circular products, the greatest opportunities arise in the lowest temperature scenario, which depends on rapid and radical temperature reductions. Now, despite everything, identifying risks and opportunities can be a challenging exercise, but it is very valuable. So to make sure that the effort is proportional to the benefit or the time spent, the ISSB standards specify that in applying specific requirements, companies shall use all information that is available at the reporting date without an undue cost or effort to disclose sustainability-related financial information. At the same time, companies are required to use all reasonable and supportable information when assessing and disclosing risks and opportunities. So this means that the information the company uses for assessing its risks and opportunities shall be specific to the company. This is important to understand the impacts on the actual company rather than in general. And at the same time, the company shall understand how it might be impacted by external factors. In some cases, reasonable and supportable information includes information about past events, current conditions, and forecasts, and this can all help identify trends and potential developments that the company should be preparing for. Furthermore, the ISSB standards also require preparers to use an approach that is commensurate with skills, capabilities, and resources when applying certain requirements. With that, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Tiffany.
Great. Thanks very much, Landon. So now we've identified risks and opportunities. then companies need to start to evaluate the financial effects that we were talking about earlier of those risks and opportunities. And this can sometimes be the most daunting when first starting, trying to identify exactly what is that impact we're looking at. So let's just look at a few different tools and resources that you can get started on if you haven't already. Now, first here, let's look at resilience. Now, as a reminder, S2, so when we're talking about climate, requires a company to disclose information about the implications of climate change on its strategy and its business model, and also asks the company's financial and operational capacity to adjust or adapt over the short, the medium, and the long term. So, for example, you might test your company's resilience against new regulation to climate emissions taxes, for example, or your company's ability to respond to changing crop yields due to more frequent heat waves if you have agriculture in your business or in your value chain. So to do this, you will use a scenario analysis and scenarios based on science, and analyze how these scenarios will lead to the company's incurring effects. I think what's really important to remember with a scenario analysis is that it doesn't require you to predict the future. Actually, it recognizes you can't predict the future. That's why we always use, 2 or more scenarios. So we're looking at different futures that might unfold, but it allows you to then use the science that's already been developed to test what that might look like in the future and how your company might react and be resilient through those different changes. So maybe just to note too that S2 does not specify which scenarios that a company shall use in its analysis, but it does require certain things of a company. So it requires a company to use a relevant scenario and to provide information about the scenarios it has selected. So the scenarios you choose obviously have to make sense. If a scenario is heavily looking at, for example, agriculture, and your business has nothing to do with agriculture and it's not in the value chain of your business, maybe that's not the right scenario for you. It also requires a company to provide information about other relevant assumptions it is used in the scenario analysis, especially if you're maybe using what we call an out-of-box scenario, so a scenario that's already been developed by an organization that you're then testing your company with. Maybe you add different scenarios and you adjust it slightly. We need to understand what those assumptions you've used are. S2 also includes a guidance on how a company can determine its approach to a scenario analysis. And this encompasses, a wide range of practices from qualitative scenario narratives to complex statistical modeling. So do remember that you have that additional guidance in S2 as well. Just to note before we move on from this slide, considering all of this, the ISSB standard does indicate that it requires a company to first and foremost, use an approach that is commensurate with the company's circumstances. And second, use all reasonable and supportable information that is available to the company at the reporting date without undue cost or effort. So let's look at an example again to add a bit of color here. So this one comes from Cemex, which is a Mexican multinational building materials company. They're active in over 50 countries. And Cemex uses here a scenario analysis, and in its integrated report, it illustrates how it then combines this analysis with its assessment of progress against stated policies, against SDGs, those Sustainable Development Goals, or other global commitments, and its net zero targets. And so for those of you not familiar with net zero targets, those are the targets that the company's setting for when it wants to achieve net zero, meaning reducing its emissions as much as possible and then offsetting the additional emissions. So this table describes risks at the top half, and at the bottom half we can see then opportunities. And they also actually include a table on the page before. So if you wanted to open up this report once you're looking at the slides yourself, you can see in the table before, they outline the 3 scenarios that were used in their analysis. So they include in there the source of those scenarios, where they found those scenarios, the temperature range and reference temperature scenarios, as well as the main assumptions that were used in each scenario, which we keep discussing. Those assumptions are so important. So remember, when using a tool like a scenario analysis, it's really important that investors understand how you're using that tool. I think what's really interesting about this disclosure example is that overall, they've actually identified by using different scenarios that opportunities for their business outweigh the risks. Now, we saw that in a couple other examples too, that companies are really showing how these opportunities outweigh the risks. And of course, we don't want to be greenwashing where we're just talking about opportunities, but the standards give you really good guidance to make sure that you're providing a really balanced discussion with your investors and showing them how you are prepared to capitalize on those opportunities and what your plan is moving forward, so that they can have confidence in what you're saying in your disclosures. Also note here, they show really good alignment through all of their goals. And often we can see kind of that sustainability reports or the sustainability related aspect of annual reports might be a little bit, you can tell it's written by different departments. So making sure that we're pulling it all together, that there's one clear voice and that we haven't used, different assumptions for one assessment as we have for another assessment is really important here. Now, one other thing I want to discuss before we move on to the last part of this unit, and that's future events and uncertain outcomes. So anticipating the materiality of future events can also be quite challenging. So to help with this determination, IFRS S1 asks that you consider a number of issues to help you with your determination. So you could think of this list as kind of identifying the steps and information you needed to come to your judgments on this materiality. So for example, companies should be considering all low probability and high impact events. Also, any uncertainty related to the company's future cash flows should be evaluated. And another important point here is the need to reassess at each reporting period. So this slide can be a useful kind of almost checklist to make sure that you're assessing all the information needed when you're making those judgments in your evaluation. Great. And with that, I'm going to pass back to Landon, who will take us through the last section of this unit. Over to you, Landon.
Great, thanks, Tiffany. So as noted, this is the third and final concept of the unit. After identification and evaluation, we have integrate. So as you may remember from the content section in the align unit, disclosures shall include a description of how climate and or sustainability related risk management practices are integrated into the holistic risk management processes. However, this is often an area where we get a lot of questions, so let's review this again. Some companies might already have processes for collecting the content described in the last module. For example, a company might already have processes for the disclosure of corporate governance information or the disclosure of risk management processes. In those cases, the company can adjust those processes to integrate sustainability-related risks and opportunities. While in other cases, the company might need to develop new processes and plan for its integration into the company's processes over time. Some considerations to take into account when doing this is to start with a clear understanding of what processes do need to be adjusted versus those that need to be created totally from scratch. This might sound obvious, but because, as we discussed at the beginning, these processes can often stretch across an organization, there might already be a process in place in another team that could just be adapted. Then when assessing if it's an existing process can be adapted to consider sustainability-related issues, it's also important to consider and assess its suitability and whether new prioritization criteria, controls, and contributors are required. Another important aspect to consider is resources that are in place or that need to be added. With that, developing a disclosure plan is also a great way to integrate sustainability-related risks and opportunities into an organization's practices and processes. It can help a company answer a number of important questions, such as what are the company's reporting goals and objectives? For example, to comply with laws and standards or to communicate management strategies. How will different goals and requirements be managed? Which audiences does the company want to communicate with? Who will be involved in developing disclosures? For example, risk management, a company secretariat, procurement, finance, a number of departments and teams could be involved. How will those individuals and departments be organized, and what will their responsibilities be? How will the data be sourced? Can you use existing systems and controls, or perhaps you require additional data? What about assurance? And lastly, and importantly, what are the sign-off procedures? Now we'll move to an example from a British property developer, Hammerson, which illustrates the basis on which the company is reporting. What's important to note here is that in order to develop a disclosure plan, you first need to understand how and what you're reporting. So outlining the regulations, standards, and practices you're aiming to achieve from the start will make it much easier moving forward. This information is also important to the users of your reports. The users need to understand how you collected and processed the information so they can understand what it means. Two otherwise identical companies could use different methodologies to define the boundaries of their business, and this could result in completely different results in their seemingly similar reports. Considering this, Hammerson provides the reporting period for the information, the approach and scope used for data collection and verification for all of its reports, and other helpful contextual information to better understand the data. Now, agreeing to this before getting started with data collection is essential so that the right information is collected and there's no surprises at the end. Imagine having to go back and collect more information again once you've already run through your entire process. And an added benefit of this is that it also helps the readers of your report, who will be very grateful for this as well. With that, we'll do a quick Zoom poll. If you give me 1 second. Okay, hopefully that Zoom poll has popped up for everyone. So the question is a disclosure plan required by the IFRS sustainability disclosure standards? And obviously, two options here. Yes, you must disclose your plan. No, but it's a very helpful tool. Give folks a few more seconds to put in your answers. Okay, so we're seeing about a 60-40 split. Okay, answers are slowing down, so I'll end it there. And as you can see, about 63% said yes, and about 37%, a minority, said no, but it's a very helpful tool. Well, the correct answer is actually B, no. It's not required. So you might wonder, why did we talk so much about it? That's because, as we hopefully highlighted, it can be very, very helpful. Now we have one more Zoom poll. Give me 1 second here. Oh, thank you. Oh, sorry, folks. If you give me 1 second, I'll pop up the next question. Okay, there we go. Thank you. So a disclosure plan can help a company to first take control of its narrative within general purpose financial reports. Or B, so support collaboration, knowledge sharing, cross-functional team discussions. Third, act as a reference point and audit trail. And 4, skip full disclosure as prescribed by the ISSB. Please note that, yeah, this is multiple choice, so you can select multiple answers if you think that's correct. Okay, lots of answers coming in. I'll give everyone a few more seconds to make your choices. Okay, that's about half of folks now, so we'll end the poll here. Just sharing the results. So as you'll see, 60% chose the first, 70% the second option, and 73% the third, and just 2% chose option D. So the correct answer is all but D. So it seems like a lot of folks, or almost everyone, is on the same boat, and that's great to see. With that, I'll stop sharing and turn it over to Fiona for the Module 3 summary.
Thanks, Landon. Great. So me back to wrap up again. So again, I'm just going to recap with you a few of the key things that we have covered in this module before we then go into another bit of an interactive exercise to get you thinking about the concepts. So connections clearly is a really important piece here. So in the last module, we wrapped up by highlighting the importance of connections between those 4 different content areas of disclosure. And then what we learned in this module was that there are many connections as well between a company and its external and internal environment. And these connections are what we need to focus on to identify key risks and opportunities. The second thing that we discussed in this module was related to evaluating those risks and opportunities. And a key component of that evaluation is consistency in your assumptions. And using scenario analysis can be a very helpful tool here, as it helps you to keep track of those assumptions. If you're new to scenario analysis, the pre-packaged scenarios, such as those from Network for Greening the Financial System, or NGFS, can provide you with a lot of those assumptions that you can start with to consider evaluating those financial effects. And again, those resources will be shared with you in the handout materials from the session. And finally, as we've seen here, even if some of this data isn't data that you're already disclosing, you might actually already be collecting it for different reasons. Or you may have the appropriate practices or processes in place to be able to collect it. You just need to make some slight adjustments to those processes. So really important to reiterate that we very much hope that you won't need to start from scratch with this. Really make sure to build on either that existing data that you might already have, all those processes that you can use to collect it, if not. So I will now move us into another Menti exercise, which again has been open, so some of you may have already started to take a look at this. So what we'd now like to ask you to think about is, what are those existing systems and processes for data collection that you're going to need to adapt to collect sustainability data? So again, we're thinking here around the data collection process, but also the data management process. So what really are the considerations that you might have there about how to collect this data and how to manage it? So I will share the Menti again for you to give us your thoughts, which we'll run through, and then give you a couple of other ideas as well from our side. Great. I see we already have several responses in already. So thank you for those who are ahead of the game here. So I'll just have a read of some of these responses whilst I let the rest of you have a little think about this and share your thoughts as well. So we have I think someone here has given us potentially 4 really good answers here to consider different aspects. So on the financial reporting side, we've got leveraging existing financial data collection methods. Definitely, I think that's such a great approach because, you're really going to ensure that those controls are in place, that you need to collect information in a robust way, and also really drive that integration and ownership of reporting into the business as well. Risk management frameworks, so adapting your existing risk assessment processes to include sustainability risks and use your existing tools to identify and analyze those risks. Definitely a super helpful approach to use what you already have in place on the risk management front. Employee surveys, so gathering employee feedback to get their insights on initiatives and areas of improvement. Absolutely. I think when it comes to thinking about those actions that you're going to take to manage sustainability related risks and opportunities, kind of crowdsourcing ideas from that from those that you have in your business who will know these topics best in an operational way is a really valuable approach. And then these are lovely answers, so I'm going to keep going with them. We've got regulatory compliance reporting, so adapting processes used for compliance with environmental regulations to include those additional sustainability metrics. Yeah, another really good suggestion as well, because of course, you will have those existing processes for legal update to scan for legal requirements and help you manage change within the business to adopt those requirements. So using these processes that you have, even if the requirements may be slightly different here, is a really helpful structure. So thank you to that person. And then we'll have a little look at some more answers here. So again, financial reporting systems, operational data systems. It's right, actually, because, you know, a lot of this information may be collected for other reasons in the business. So, you know, for example, in your HR systems, in your equipment monitoring systems, in you know, engineering and industrial sectors, etc. And you may have a lot of really valuable data that you can harvest from those. Using AI to get real-time sustainability data, yep, that sounds like a fantastic approach if you can figure that out. I have to say I'm personally still getting my head around what AI means in this space, I think as we all are, but I think it's no doubt going to play a really important role in speeding up and bringing efficiencies in these sorts of processes. Again, lots of people referring to enterprise reporting platforms, exactly, potentially using surveys, questionnaires, lots of that response, which I think is definitely helpful, particularly when you're at the stage of just wanting to understand what you can get. And when we're thinking about perhaps suppliers or stakeholders of our business, understanding what they need or what your customers need as well, surveys can be a really good approach. Monthly management reports, risk registers, yeah, looking at your board reporting and your corporate KPIs. Lots of really useful suggestions here. I think we have a few similar themes, definitely, but I think it's great to see everyone is kind of really getting that sense of using what you have, using your financial and risk processes to support you here in that way. So that's very helpful. I'll just see if there are any things coming up that we haven't heard already. Lots and lots of responses, so this is very valuable. Feel free to scroll through those. Again, we've mentioned third-party audit, which again, I think is helpful here, and scenario analysis tools. Yes, definitely. I think although you know, taking a bespoke approach to scenario analysis that suits your organization can be a very helpful thing to get to in time. If you're just getting started with scenarios, then using those existing tools that are out there, such as NGFS, which we mentioned earlier, can be a really helpful starting point. Brilliant. Yeah, lots of very good ideas here. That's super. I suspect you will have captured everything that we had in mind from our end as well, but I will just stop sharing now so we can regroup on that. I think probably the only things additionally that we would mention is around perhaps the existing data management that you have for your financial or annual reporting processes. So, for example, if your organization is using the XBRL taxonomy to tag its financial reporting, that software and that structure of the taxonomy is something that can be really helpful to use here, and is something we'll talk about further in the next segment. And finally, I think we did briefly touch on it in the responses there, but looking at your governance structures as well. So just reiterating that as you're setting up these data management practices, as much as you can consider governance at the outset of that process, that is very valuable to get in place right from the start. So, you know, what are the controls around this information? What evidence are you gathering? And how are you ensuring that it's going to be in a good shape for potential future audit and assurance as well? Okay, no, thank you everyone for such great input and participation again into that exercise. It's really helpful for everyone, I'm sure, to hear those different perspectives and suggestions that you have. So I will now hand over to Bella, who's going to start us on Module 4. Thank you.
Thanks, Fiona.
We are now on to the final unit of this training, which focuses on the when and the where of disclosure of sustainability-related financial information. As with the last unit, we have three main sections. To get us started, we will look at the location. In this section, we are looking to clarify where sustainability disclosures should be located. So before we dive into the specific requirements, let's think about sustainability disclosures in the context of a complete reporting package that is useful to investors. Investors already have access to a company's financial statements. ISSB standards are designed to identify sustainability-related risks and opportunities that complement the financial statements. These all come together in a reporting package that we call a general purpose financial report. The requirements in ISSB standards about what information to report are based on existing sustainability reporting regimes, focuses on investor information needs, and on aspects of financial accounting standards. ISSB and the GRI reporting standards share some content requirements, but the ISSB standards are focused only on investors' information needs and the decision-making, reflecting the mission of the IFRS Foundation, which is to bring transparency, accountability, and efficiency to capital markets around the world. Both organizations take different approaches to defining materiality, but they are not competing. The GRI approach is set out and understood among sustainability practitioners, whereas the IFRS approach is familiar to accountants and relies heavily on management judgment, which is aligning with existing corporate risk management processes. A simple example is where a double materiality assessment identifies that some of the company's impacts may also create sustainability risks, which could be so significant that they are important to disclose to investors. So as we just noted, materiality has different definitions for different reporting standards and audiences. So let's briefly recap what we mean by material information for the IFRS. In identifying material information to be disclosed, a company will first need to identify the sustainability-related risks and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect its prospects. Once the company has identified those risks and opportunities, it can then determine what information to provide about those risks and opportunities. This is where our materiality definition comes into play. The definition of material information used in S1 is based on and aligned with definition found in the IFRS accounting standards. It is information that, if omitted, misstated, or obscured by other information, could reasonably be expected to influence investor decisions. In other words, the ISSB standards seek to identify disclosure of key information that matters to investors. Investors have asked for disclosure of material information, and the ISSB standards have been designed to help you gather and disclose it. However, this means that a company doesn't need to disclose information that is not material, even if the ISSB standards include it as a specific requirement. So just remember to ensure material information is clearly identifiable and that you use plain language. And also ensure material information is not scattered across your disclosure. Finally, include any additional or non-material disclosures if required by regulators, but ensure it is clearly identified as such. So let's do a Zoom poll now. Okay. Okay. So everyone, I hope everyone can see the Zoom poll 11. Yes, it's about information should be disclosed in the annual report when applying SSB standards. If there are three options, A is admitting that information could reasonably be expected to influence investors' decisions. And B is it could reasonably be expected to affect the company's cash flows. And the option C is it exemplifies the values of the leadership team. Okay, just wait a few seconds. Okay, half of our attendees have responded. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Yes, just remember the definition of material information. It is information that, if omitted, misstated, or obscured by other information, could reasonably be expected to influence investor decisions. So based on this definition, option A and option B are correct. In terms of option C, well, unless it has been determined that the particular values being exemplified are expected to have a financial effect on the company, this may not be the information that is necessary. So C is not the right answer. Okay, so let's move on. Disclosure under the SSB standards has to accompany the financial statements and be part of the same general purpose financial reporting package. But S1 doesn't say where in that reporting package the information shall be provided. This is designed to allow jurisdiction-specific requirements on the location of reporting. The most important factor to consider here is to ensure that sustainability disclosures are provided as part of the same reporting package as the company's financial statements. Sustainability disclosures must be provided at the same time as the related financial statements, cover the same reporting period as the financial statements, and authorized by the same body or individual authorizing the financial statements. Research by WBCSD on the state of integrated reporting shows that nearly 2/3 of companies continue to put sustainability information in standalone reports. However, the SSB standards require material sustainability-related financial disclosures to be included with the general purpose financial reports. This suggests many companies have some way to go to get their internal process and disclose plans aligned. So now let's look at the example, and I'm going to hand over to Lois.
Thanks, Bella. Yes, well, as Bella was explaining, companies are required to put sustainability-related financial information into a general purpose financial report that may contain a lot of other things, will contain a lot of other things, including the financial statements. So we're going to have a look at an example from Ayala's integrated report about how they approach the organization and navigation of information in their integrated report. And Ayala is a Philippines-based conglomerate with lots of different activities over property development, banks, healthcare, technology, and so on. So on this page, this extract from their integrated report, we see a diagram that sets out the company's value creation framework. So it shows on the left-hand side the different types of capital, financial, intellectual, human, social, and relationship, that feed into the value creation model in the dark blue box in the middle. And then in the right-hand side of the extract, we see the types of value generated from their value creation model. Now, as well as setting out the value creation model and framework in a single page here, what the company is doing is describing the different elements of the report. So you can see that the blue arrows show us page references. So we see the strategies at page 50. We can see that the business information, page 54, ESG priorities, page 76. We get a picture of how the information is organized against the background of the company's value creation model. So lots of different things integrated here, but with a very clear navigation process for finding information and understanding the links between risks, opportunity, inputs, processes, and outputs. So an interesting way of describing how the integrated report is structured. So of course, this presupposes something written, something's prepared on paper or a digital PDF, but Bella's now going to tell us more about digital reporting.
And thanks, Lois. Well, yes, technology is an emerging consideration for disclosures. Corporate reporting is moving from PDF reports towards information on web pages with structured datasets, such as those datasets offered by stock exchanges. The IFRS Foundation has created the ISSB taxonomy, which reflects the requirements and the accompanying materials of the ISSB standards. So the taxonomy doesn't introduce any new requirement. A digital taxonomy provides the common elements or text needed to make your sustainability disclosures machine readable. This makes it easier to take large datasets, like information from an entire industry, and bring them all together to analyze them. Digital reporting has a number of benefits, such as it makes the reporting information easier to use for analysis, and tagging information potentially allows for automated checks for quality and consistency. And tags can have labels and descriptions in multiple languages. If you report your quantitative data in one language, someone speaking another language can also understand what it means. Following the discussion on location and the timing, let's now think about ensuring efficient disclosures. We added this to the training because a common comment we find from companies is that there is a growing reporting burden. What we hope to highlight is that when done correctly, efficiencies can be made to reduce that burden. So first of all, it's important to understand what effective communication looks like and what is required. Often companies think that if they just put all the information they have into a report, then everyone will be satisfied. However, this would be against the core concepts, in particular file presentation. For example, it could be helpful to ask these questions. Is the information clear and concise? So for the concept of clear, this might depend on the nature of the information. For example, whether it could be clearer to present information in tables, graphs, diagrams, plus accompanying text. In terms of concise, disclosures need to avoid boilerplate information, unnecessary duplication of information, and to use clear language. When preparing reports, it's crucial to ensure the quality of information. This means, for example, disclosures include comparative information and are to be restated as necessary. And also, disclosures avoid unnecessary duplication and cross-reference as required. And finally, information has to be material, be connected, and be aggregated or disaggregated appropriately. As you may have already noticed, there may appear to be some overlap in the disclosure topics. For example, you might have the same governance approach for all sustainability issues. Rather than duplicate certain information, you can use cross-referencing to enhance efficiency of your disclosures. Cross-referencing to other reports is permitted as long as the other report is available on the same terms and at the same time as the sustainability disclosures. The cross-referenced information is assumed to become part of the reporting package. Cross-referencing shall be applied consistently and transparently. It shall not result in the information becoming more difficult to understand. Now let's look at another example. So hand over to you, Lois.
Thanks, Bella. And this is an example from a company called CRH from their 2022 annual report. And CRH is a company based in Ireland that supplies a wide range of products for the construction industry. So what we're looking at here is an example of cross-referencing, an example of connectivity. So at the top of the page, the title tells us that this disclosure is about the impact of climate change and emissions reductions targets. And the example is about how those things have been considered within the financial statements. So as long as as well as our sustainability professionals being busy preparing sustainability disclosures, our finance department colleagues will be busy preparing financial statements. And this example shows how there can be cross-reference between the two. So in the first paragraph, the company tells us where we can find information about the climate risks that they have identified, and they tell us how those risks and reduction efforts have been considered in the preparation of the final statements, the financial statements. So you can see right in the middle of the page there's a cross-reference to pages. You can see the page numbers where the company's considered, do the climate risks have any effect on our impairment testing of goodwill, property, plant and equipment? Do the risks mean any changes in the useful lives of assets, the way in which we need to prepare provisions for liabilities on our inventories or on our retirement benefit obligations? So they're cross-referring here to the pages in the financial statements where we find these numbers and where they have thought about whether the climate risks they have identified affect these numbers. What they conclude is they tell us that there has been no material impact on the financial statements as a result of those risks. They've made that judgment using the company's existing accounting policies, estimates, and underlying assumptions. So the fact that they've told us that there are no material impacts is actually useful information for investors and others, because it helps the investors understand that the company has actually considered the link between their statements on climate risk and the financial statements. And we see the cross-reference between the two here, as Bella had explained earlier. So I'll hand back to Bella now for the next section.
Thanks, Lois. Oh, sorry. Okay, let's look at mechanisms that support adoption. Yes, we have sought to apply a number of mechanisms to support preparers get started with the SSB standards. One simple thing put in place was to adopt well-known terminology and concepts familiar to preparers, borrowing from IASB, for example. Many requirements in S1 and S2 are to be applied proportionately, recognizing companies will have a range of capabilities and preparedness on these issues. For example, qualitative scenario analysis is permitted, and you will see the phrase all reasonable and supportable information at the reporting date without undue cost or effort, all commensurate with skills, capabilities, and resources in a number of places. Reliefs for the first year of application have also been introduced and include companies being able to limit disclosures to climate in year 1 and begin reporting on their other sustainability-related risks and opportunities in year 2. Another relief is companies being able to provide annual sustainability-related financial disclosures with their next half-year reporting, rather than at the same time as the financial statements. Companies not needing to provide disclosures about Scope 3 GHG emissions apply the GHG Protocol corporate standard to measure emissions if they are already using a different measurement approach or provide comparative information in their first year of reporting using S1 and S2. Another relief allows companies to include GHG emissions information obtained from companies in the value chain with a different reporting cycle. We've already mentioned a number of other sources of guidance and resources, including SASB standards, CDSB framework application guidance, among many others. These reliefs are designed to enable companies to put in place reporting practices and structures to provide high-quality, decision-useful information. Jurisdictions will decide when to mandate adoption, but the standards are effective from the first day of 2024, and we know many companies are now preparing to adopt them voluntarily. So next, let's look at another Zoom poll. Okay, information disclosed in accordance with SFB standards should be, there are 4 options: decision useful, material, misleading, comparable. Well, I think this question is quite simple for all of you. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Yes, the right answer, A, B, and D. Misleading is the wrong answer. Okay, let's move to the next Zoom poll. Yes, I think you can see the new Zoom poll. Information is decision useful if it is relevant and faithfully represent what it purports to represent, comparable, verifiable, timely, understandable. Well, I think this question is also simple for all of you. Okay, I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Well, yes, the right answer are all of them. So information is decision useful if it is relevant and faithfully represent, comparable, verifiable, timely, understandable. Okay, so let's move on. Okay. Finally, the last section of our last unit looks at how you can ensure that the users of financial reports have confidence in the data you are disclosing, as trust is an essential component of sustainability-related disclosures, and increasingly so with the growing concern over greenwashing. Okay, an important trust builder is showing data and trends over time. This is why SSB standards act for comparatives. Comparative information provides context, helps to indicate progress, and underpins strategy and risk management. Metrics disclosed by a company might be redefined or replaced over time, or the company might change its method of estimating a metric. In these situations, it's important for the company to revise the comparatives to enable investors to compare and analyze current period figures with the relevant prior period figures. Occasionally, a company's sustainability disclosures might contain material errors. In this situation, the company is required to restate these errors in the comparatives provided. Revisions or restatements are necessary only when there is a risk that material information being omitted, misstated, or obscured as a result of not revising or restating the comparatives. Information can be qualitative and quantitative as well. But companies sometimes express concern with sharing information they deem to be sensitive, or that if shared should deplete their competitive advantages. The SSB standards relieve a company from disclosing information about a sustainability-related opportunity if that information is commercially sensitive. If this is a concern you have, there is further detail you can read in the handout. Yes, finally, it's important to build confidence by providing clear statements of compliance. A company that complies with all requirements in the SSB standards is required to make an explicit statement of compliance. We published further guidance on this topic, which is voluntarily applying SSB standards, a guide for preparers. Okay, now we are almost there. Here are a few things to remember. First, remember the characteristics of information is relevant, material, representative, faithfully comparable, verifiable, timely, understandable. And also remember the connections between sustainability-related risks and opportunities, connections between disclosures on core content, connections between sustainability-related financial disclosures and the financial statements. A few more things to remember, such as the reporting period and company, material information, comparative information, statement of compliance, etc. You can find in the handout slide deck an additional slide in this section with reminders of how to report effectively. I highly recommend reviewing that. Okay, now I'm going to hand over to Fiona.
Thank you, Bella. And if you've been following the flow of today's session, I think you'll know that if you're seeing me again, it's time for a module wrap-up. And you'll be pleased to know it's our final module. So we'll recap this and then run through a few closing points with you before we close off the session. So just to cover back again what we talked about. So first we covered where to report information. And what was important here was the audience or who you're reporting to. So make sure to be clear from the start who the primary user of the information is, and that will help you to ensure that the information is the right information for their needs. We then talked about efficiency, and I think a key takeaway here is really that less is more. The objective isn't to overload your investors with information, which actually could be harmful and obscure the information that's material, but really to use the standards as you get started is a good guide to make sure that you're giving your investors the information that they need, which of course is the fundamental purpose of the ISSB standards. And finally, we talked about report user confidence. So especially in the current climate where greenwashing accusations are quite a concern, where we see, a number of high-profile legal battles over public statements, you do want to ensure that the data that you're using is not only accurate, but that it's presented in a way that builds confidence among report users. So the reporting plan that we've been discussing here can help you to do this. And if you do it right, you'll have a clear and documented process for reporting the data investors need. So we definitely really encourage you to take away that homework. As Tiffany has reshared with you in the chat there, it's available to download on the event webpage. By no means is it compulsory. It's really for your benefit and to help support you in your next steps, practically moving this forward. So absolutely encouraged, but just use that tool as you find it valuable. So to close out, we'll just have a quick look in Menti again. So I will share screens with you all in a second. So some of you may have spotted already that we have a new Menti open for you to share some of your thoughts on the different techniques that you can use to support navigation in your reporting. So just to make sure we have time to close out our final comments, I won't spend too long with you on this exercise, but some of these ideas that we've had from the group here are very helpful in terms of using a table of contents to make your report easier to navigate, avoiding jargon where you can, using graphs and other visuals to summarize key information and to kind of structure things in a clear way, I think are all fantastic ideas. I think you've captured everything that we'd really recommend here, but I would also just remind you of using navigation panes in your report so people can really understand where they are in the structure of your disclosure, and also thinking about the digital nature of your reports. So obviously one step in that regard is making sure you have a PDF available on your website, but actually thinking about the interactivity of the digital report is really helpful too. So can you use hyperlinking through the sections, for example, to support people in jumping around and finding the content that they need? So I'll leave you with a few ideas that the team have shared there. And in the interest of time, I will move us along because you also have the opportunity to reflect on this in your homework handout, as we mentioned already. So a quick poll just to get a sense from you all in terms of where you're at the end of today's session. So we asked you this question here at the beginning of the session in terms of how comfortable you are with each of these tasks. And it would be really helpful to get a sense of where you feel you may be up to now in building your understanding of what the ISSB is, of how you use the ISSB standards, and how you can really develop your sustainability reporting strategy. So I'll just give you a second to input your responses there. And I think that's already really positive to see that many of you, I think, are having shifted along that scale there from being a little bit less comfortable to being a little bit more. So that's really positive to know. Of course, we know that we cannot solve the entire thing in one session, and a lot of this is going to be about taking away those guidance and resources that we have discussed to further consider in your own time. But we hope we've given you a really good starting point for that. And then this further question here, I will leave you to complete in your own time, if that's okay, just in the interests of time, but do feel free to share with us any thoughts you might have on what was good about the training, or even anything that you might like to see as well in the future. But what we will do now is just at the end of this interactive time we have together is to wrap up quickly. So yeah, as I mentioned on your homework, it's a exercise to take away in your own time. You can find it on our website, and the link has been shared in the chat as well with you. So it takes you through those 4 steps really that we've used in the structure of today's session regarding prepare, align, implement, and communicate. And so if you follow the structure of the assignment, it should really enable you to develop your first draft ISSB aligned disclosure plan for your company. and that will hopefully help you to put into action what you've learned during today's training. So we do really encourage you to take that away, and of course to share it with your colleagues as well, and perhaps to get their inputs and thoughts about the concepts that we've discussed today. And for those of you that would like to continue your learning from what we've talked on, don't forget to make use of the IFRS Knowledge Hub. So as we talked about at the beginning, this is a regularly updated resource with lots of relevant guidance and materials on there. So please do share with your stakeholders as well. And of course, you have the guidance materials associated with each of the standards in question. If we look at some other resources we can refer to, we'd really encourage you to use the IFC's resources as well. They have a great toolkit called Beyond the Balance Sheet, which provides a really comprehensive set of resources cutting across sustainability, corporate governance, and disclosure. And as a final reminder, the SSE works closely with the IFRS in this space. So for those who missed it at the start, here's a couple of our key resources, which links will be shared to in the chat as well for you. And of course, do make sure to keep an eye out for our future training courses as well, which you can book via our webpage or contact us at training@sseinitiative.org. And those contact details will be in the PowerPoint presentation and materials for you to take away. So we really encourage you to make use of this resource that we provide no cost to stock exchanges. So a big thank you and well done to those of you who have stuck with us so far in the training. We recognize 3.5 hours is a long time and there's a lot to cover, but we really appreciate all of the questions and interaction you've given us throughout today's session, and indeed all of the lovely reactions we're getting at the moment as well in the chat. That's great to see. So as a merit and reward for all that hard work and listening you've been doing, you'll be pleased to know you are eligible to receive a certificate to show your completion of the course for those who've attended it live today. So what you'll need to do is fill out a feedback survey, the link to which will be shared with you in the chat, and you will also find in our presentation materials. And if you can fill out that survey, just giving us some feedback, then you will receive your certificate through. Please note that it may take up to a week to receive your certificate, but do keep an eye out and we'll share that with you as soon as we can. And before we finish off, just a few words of appreciation to cover. So a big thank you to all of the SSE supporters who promote our work and have made this training possible. So supporters receive early access to all our training programs as well. So definitely something to consider joining for anyone it may apply to. And final thank yous, of course, to our partners at the IFC and the IFRS Foundation, and especially to Jarlath and Bella for all of the great insights they've shared with you today, and Robert, who is supporting them in the chat on behalf of myself, Lois, Tiffany, and Landon in the SSE team. We really, really appreciate it. And a final thank you, of course, to you all for joining us, and for the Botswana Stock Exchange for hosting us too. We've so appreciated the opportunity to engage with you all, and wish you a very happy rest of your day. Thank you very much, everyone. Glad to hear it didn't feel like 3 hours after all, Lami. That's great news.